Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. But would it really be so bad? My mother asked me, as we mulled over the movie we'd been enjoying that evening. We loved discussing what we watched together. We would often watch movies on the settee, accompanied by a delicious large bowl of buttered honey and cinnamon-flavoured popcorn, along with large iced glasses of fizzy Mountain Dew, so that you could be forgiven into believing that we were actually at a movie theatre, when in fact we were at home all along in our living room, enjoying the benefits of a massive flat-screen television. At the time my father was playing bridge with an old friend who lived on the upper side of Manhattan, bounded by 96th Street to the north, which was only a street away from where we lived, in our New York neo-Italian Renaissance-styled apartment building. "Are you kidding me, Mum? Imagine discovering your biological father was not really your father at all. It's got to be pretty devastating." I said this, popping the popcorn into my mouth with gusto. "Let's not kid. I can't imagine how I would react in the circumstances if it were to happen to me." "But," repeated my mother, her hands clasping the coffee mug so tightly that I could see her white knuckles were beginning to show, "by all accounts the young man had a very, very good life. I mean, what more could he have asked for? The father absolutely adored him. They loved each other to pieces. Isn't that all that matters in the end? It's not all about biological bloodlines, surely." "Yes, but it was all a lie, Mum. Did the father not deserve to know that his son was not his own? Did he not at least have that intrinsic right? What about the real father? Wasn't he entitled to know that he had fathered a child of his own? And as for the poor son, he was a victim in all of this because of his mother's adulterous affair. It was grossly unfair for him to have been left in the dark. Doesn't he have the right to know about his family roots and bloodlines?" "I think it happens more than you know," said my mother. "Fathers, I mean, who falsely believe that they are the genuine father when they're clearly not. I mean, look at you. Do you look like your father at all? No, you don't, but you're still your father's son." She said this, raising a quizzical, questioning brow. "What are you saying, Mum?" I asked, my hands dropping the popcorn on the floor, which was intended for my mouth, my blood running cold. "What the heck are you trying to say? Don't talk in riddles, Mother." My mother looked awkward, like a round peg in a square hole that would rather be anywhere else than in this living room right now. I didn't like the way this conversation was heading, not at all. Like an anomalous hiking trail in the woods that seemed way off centre. I sensed something didn't feel right, while the hairs on the back of my neck were now standing on edge, like the prickles on a hedgehog's back. "Well, you know the therapist I've been visiting for my anxiety disorder that I've been suffering from for so many years after that dreadful car accident I had in Harlem?" I nodded. "What has that got to do with anything, Mother?" "A whole lot, as it happens. You see, Dr. Huxley believes I need to be up front, open about everything that I've bottled up all my life. He believes all the secrecy hanging around me is robbing me of inner peace, causing me undue distress. He says I need to clear the air with you." "You need to clear the air with me? Ma'am, what the heck are you talking about? You're scaring the hell out of me." "Well, I chose the movie tonight on purpose to gauge your reaction, son. But I can see that I'm going to have to say it as it is. You are right. The boy in that story did have a right to know who his father was, just like you deserve to know the truth about yours, who he really is." I stared at my mother dumbfounded, my eyes wide like saucers, my mouth hanging open, my heart pounding violently in my chest. "Are you saying that Dad isn't my real father?" I watched the tears building up in my mother's eyelashes until the floodgates of her tear ducts burst open. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I was not comfortable seeing my mother cry like this, but I was confounded by what she appeared to be trying to say. I couldn't make sense of any of it. "Look at yourself in the mirror, sweetheart. Isn't it apparent you're not your father's son? You're tall, dark, handsome. You have a very distinctive olive skin and hazel eyes. Your dad has the typical Scandinavian blonde hair, blue eyes, and is so much more willowy than you are. I was certain you would figure it out one day. It was staring you blindly in the face like a dazzling light. But maybe when you don't want to see something, it's easier to pretend that it's not really there." I could feel the anger rising up in my belly. "You thought I'd figure it out one day, Mother? That's rich even coming from you. I'm very sorry to assume that I was my father's son. After all, you never told me any different. What was I supposed to think? Does Dad even know about this?" My mother shook her head of brown curls vigorously. She looked at me soulfully through her veil of tears. Her flushed face looked anguished. "No, he doesn't know about this, sweetheart. I don't think he needs to know. It really would break his heart. He loves the bones of you. Imagine how he would feel if he were to know that you were not his own. I'm quite sure it would tear him apart, limb from limb." "So it's fine not to break his heart, but it's all right to break mine, is it?" I said sarcastically. "Well, Dr. Huxley felt I should let you know about your real father, so that you can seek him out to get to know him better. If you can find him, of course, and that, of course, is a big if." I felt as if I'd been run over by a combine harvester and spat out by the machine. My mind was a whirl, my emotions in turmoil, my thoughts confused. I didn't know what to feel or think. "I know this is an awful shock for you, sweetheart, but I'm not going to kid. I do feel significantly relieved to get this off my chest finally. You know, Dr. Huxley was absolutely right about that. I already feel as if a weight has been lifted off my shoulders." "Well, I'm very glad you feel relieved, Mother, because if you must know, I feel anything but. You've handed the weight over to me. I feel like the kid standing on the road, accidentally mown down by a forklift truck, as if I'd been tossed into limbo with everything I thought I knew about myself lying scattered around in smithereens. I don't even know who I am anymore. If I'm not my dad's son, then who am I? Where do I come from?" "Don't be so angry, sweetheart. I've had to live with a secret all my life. It's been eating away at me like a worm burrowing away in an apple. It has a lot to do with my depression and anxiety issues that I've been experiencing over the years, along with the perpetual guilt I feel." "Who is he?" I asked. "My real father, I mean. Does he even know about my existence?" My mother took a big glug of her coffee that was now icy cold, but she barely noticed. Her eyes stared fixedly into space, as though she'd seen a bug on the wall or a leak on the ceiling that she hadn't noticed before. "Look at me, Mother." "Your father looks exactly like you, your real father, I mean. You're the splitting image of him. I've not seen him for many years. His name is Connor Grayson." "Connor Grayson," I repeated, rolling the name on my tongue. "That's right," said my mother. "He was not the settling down type of man, never pretended to be either. I remember he even told me when we first met that our relationship would never amount to anything serious. He was a maverick, enjoyed nothing better than living off-grid in the natural world, far from any human habitation, which is why he went to live in the Alaskan wilderness. When I learnt where he was living, I wasn't the least bit surprised. But locating him won't be easy, unless of course I can contact his sister, who lives not far from here. I often see her in passing at the bus stop. She gives me a wave often. Very nice lady." "But why did you not tell him about me?" "It's complicated," said my mother. "I was in a relationship with 2 men at the time, one being your father, of course. They didn't know about each other, so when I discovered I was pregnant, I wasn't exactly sure who the father was. I wasn't a floozy son, never. I just really liked both men at the time. I couldn't decide whom I liked more. So I was stuck between a rock and a hard place, but I knew I had a decision to make, and it was a no-brainer for me. I decided to tell your dad that he had made me pregnant. I knew he was the settling down type. He'd definitely make the better father. Once he knew I was pregnant, he popped the question without hesitation. The rest is history, of course. I wasn't sure an intrepid explorer or adventurer like Connor would react too happily about my being pregnant. He was a lone wolf. If I'd married him, I'd have ended up living off-grid in the middle of nowhere. You know me, son. I love my creature comforts. The idea of living in the sticks with a composting toilet or a smelly outhouse is not my idea of a great time. For a while, maybe, but no, certainly not indefinitely. Connor loved all that sort of stuff. Fishing, hunting, hiking, exploring, growing your own vegetables, living off the land. That was what he was all about. I was much more socially inclined than he was. Long term, we would have never worked out. We both knew it. We had different dreams. So let's get this right. You lied to Dad. You lied to Connor. You lied to both men. No, I finished it with Connor. He didn't know I was pregnant at the time. I told him that this adventuring lifestyle was certainly not for me. He seemed relieved, which really was rather a blow to my self-esteem, but there you go. So I'm right to assume you had a DNA test to establish that I am, in fact, Connor's son? Of course not, sweetheart. I didn't need to do that. You're beginning to sound exactly like Dr. Huxley. He asked me exactly the same thing. You don't need a DNA test, son. Not in a month of Sundays. I just need to look at you and know that you are Connor's boy. There isn't an ounce of your father's Scandinavian blood running in your bones. But I can see Connor's indigenous American roots in your look. It's obvious to see. As you can imagine, my head was spinning in circles, having to assimilate these appalling revelations. Me and my father were like 2 peas in a pod, with interests in common that had increased over the years, bringing us close together. I regarded my dad as my very best friend in the entire world, and now my mother was forcing me to keep this insidious, dark secret from him. In truth, I wasn't sure that I was even capable of maintaining this duplicitous, guileful charade from my father. But my mother was absolutely right. It would break his heart to learn the truth. For if my feelings were anything to go on, I didn't want my father to experience any of them. My heart felt crushed like an ostrich egg that had been cracked wide open, vulnerable, insecure, uncertain, confused, and exceedingly disorientated. Naturally, I did some research as to the whereabouts of my biological father. I found that he was indeed living off-grid in Alaska, as I had suspected. I found out the details of his location from his sister. My mother occasionally saw her at the bus stop, so it was easy to find out his details. I learnt that she visited him a couple of times a year. I felt it was important to get to know the man, and at the very least let him know I was his son. I informed his sister very graciously that I needed to see Connor about a very delicate matter, but I gave no more information. Before long I was invited to spend the weekend with Connor at his off-grid cabin in Alaska, and the surprising thing about it all is that no questions were actually asked about the nature of my visit, which I thought was exceedingly odd. I was a city slicker through and through, with about as much experience of the natural world as a domestic tabby, who falsely believes the feeding machine in your kitchen is some kind of a strange tree that grows cat pellets at random. I had lived in New York all my life, so going to Alaska was going to be a great big eye-opener for me. I had heard about the scenic, resplendent beauty of this wondrous place. I was exceedingly intrigued by the mountains, glaciers, volcanoes, tundra, lakes, highway passes, and exquisite coastline, but I certainly wasn't prepared to come so close and personal to such arresting beauty. I was fortunate to find a driver in Fairbanks willing to go the extra mile on my behalf and drop me off for the weekend at my father's place. Ironically, he knew the remote cabin exceedingly well, so a little serendipity came into play that was most warmly welcomed on my part. I was heartily relieved that Connor's cabin was in an area accessible by road, for my worst fears was his cabin was so remote that you could only access it by plane. "You're not from around here, are you?" my driver teased. "Sorry, son, but I can always pick up the city slickers a mile away. Not to put too fine a point on it, they do stick out rather like a sore thumb. Alaskan boys from the last frontier, well, they look like they belong. But you look rather like a fish out of water, if you don't mind my saying so. Even though physically you've got that Alaskan look about you, the strong body, the well-developed muscles. But your less than confident demeanour gives the game away, I'm afraid." "You're right," I said. "That's very astute of you to observe. I'm from New York. I'm a little out of my depth, I have to admit, but I'm just a tad disappointed it's so brazenly obvious to you." "Thought as much," said the man. "My name is J.C. That's what everyone around here calls me." He gave me a friendly grin and a big wink. He had the whitest teeth I'd ever seen. "I'm Weston Finnegan," I said. "Well, you've come at a good time of year, Weston. Alaska is exceedingly magnificent, especially in spring. May is our driest month of the year, you'll be glad to know. Tell me to keep my butt out of your business, but how do you happen to know Connor? He's not the most forthright, outgoing, or social of people. I know he keeps himself to himself. You do get people in Alaska a lot like him. That's why they come out here, to live off-grid, get close to nature, lost in the wilderness, avoiding people at every cost. Connor's like that, you know, loves avoiding the hoi polloi." "I don't know Connor. My mother did years ago. They used to date." "You're not," said the driver, almost stalling on the road in his astonishment. "You're not his son, are you? A son that he doesn't even know about? You look awfully like him." "Something like that." The man chuckled. "Ha ha! This is a turn-up for the books. Connor a father? Who would have thought it? Not me, that's for sure." "How do you think he's going to take it?" I asked wryly. "The news, I mean." "Most things to Connor are water off a duck's back, but learning you're his son, well, that's like a landmine going off in your face. I can't imagine how he would take it. But then he is a good man, a true Alaskan big fellow, with a very big heart on him. But I warn you, he's reticent, private, very, very self-contained. Don't be offended by that, especially if he doesn't talk much. He's a man of few words, shall we say, but he's very well liked around these parts. Those that do get the chance to know the man, for he is elusive, let me tell you, like some of the wild animals out here." I stared outside the window, waves of doubt drifting through my mind like a lost boat at sea. I began to seriously doubt whether looking for Connor had been such a good idea after all. Perhaps I'd be opening a can of worms, making things 1,000 times worse. But I did have the right to meet my father, surely, despite the bizarre, outlandish circumstances. He also had the right to meet his own son, didn't he? It was a magnificent spring morning. The mountain air was fresh, crisp, dewy, clean, while the soft sunshine infused, bespeckled the landscape with a gentle, ethereal golden glaze that, like a magic wand, caused everything to twinkle, sparkle, and shimmer under its bedazzling shafts of pretty light, so that the viridescent, resplendent greens looked greener, richer, lusher, the cobalt sky bluer, while the silvery lakes reminded me of jewelled mirrors, as on their gleaming surfaces pictures of the landscape floated like wispy thin paper boats on the water. Then there were the masterful, powerful, undulating, graceful curls and twists of the mountains, the glaciers, the volcanoes, rising up into the skies with solid foundations that denoted strength, power, abiding respect. "You'll be glad to know, son, it's not long now, we'll be there soon," said J.C., as we passed the prettiest alpine meadow, full of colourful spring flowers, such as Alaskan primroses, elegant paintbrushes, dwarf dogwoods, wild sweet peas, forget-me-nots, lupines, and Siberian phlox. They were bursting into bloom, caressing the meadows in bright bursts of vibrant colour, from pinks, yellows, purples, and blues. I also noticed a couple of moose grazing in the pastures happily, with racks on them that even intimidated me, they were so enormous. It was when the heavy-duty rubber wheels of JC's truck seamlessly glided over some rough terrain with a few crunching sounds beneath wheels, then the odd bump, shudder and wobble. But finally it pulled up to park outside the cutest fairy tale-like Hansel and Gretel wooden cabin that I've ever seen. It was so enchanting, nestled in the heart of the woods, as if it had always belonged there, as much as the arresting fauna and flora, as the tall spruce trees that surrounded it on every side just looked so much in place, as if they'd always been there. This was quite literally a cabin in the woods. In a trice my nerves got the better of me. I physically began to shake as JC pulled up the handbrake, switched off the engine, looking directly at me with a pair of inquiring eyes. "Ready?" he asked. "I'm already feeling nervous for you, brother." "I don't think I can do this," I stammered. I think we should go back." "With a defeatist attitude like that, son, you would never make it out here in Alaska. This is big boy country. It's for the tough, the brave, the strong, the courageous. Sometimes in life you have to face your fears head on. Alaskan men, we're good at facing our fears. It runs in our blood. You would do well to learn from the best." Before I could protest, I noticed a clean-shaven man with wavy dark hair, olive skin and hazel eyes trotting out of the log cabin towards the truck. He was handsome, well-built, muscular, strong, wearing a red plaid jacket, blue Levi jeans, and rugged all-weather boots. The scariest part of it all was that I could see myself in him, as if I was looking at myself back in the mirror. It was a surreal feeling, one I wasn't exactly sure I liked. "Bloody hell," said JC, as he watched my father moving towards the truck. "Knock my cotton socks off. You two are the splitting image of each other. I hadn't realized until now how striking the resemblance is. If your father does not know he has a son, one look at you will affirm he most certainly has. He will know it, believe me, you mark my words, he will." "Hello, JC," said the raspy, warm voice of the man peering at him through the driver's side of the window. "It's been a while." "It has," said JC. "I've brought your guest along with me," he said, indicating to me in the back. As I climbed out of the truck, Connor stared at me. His eyes grew wide, his mouth dropped open, the colour drained from his skin, as if he'd seen a ghost. For a second he never said a thing, but just gave me a brief nod, indicating for me to follow him into the cabin, while he removed my backpack from the truck and brought it indoors for me. He nodded to JC, thanking him for bringing me there, and bid him farewell. I could see JC's mouth the words to me, "Good luck," and then he was gone. Connor indicated for me to take a seat in the kitchen as he busied himself over a gas burner, preparing me a warm cup of tea. For a while he avoided any eye contact with me. His fingers were trembling violently. He seemed nervous and twitchy, almost uncertain about what to do or to say next. "There you go," he said, handing me a mug of tea. "I put 2 sugars in it. We like our sugar here in Alaska. Everything in Alaska has to be sweet." "So what do you think of Alaska?" "It's beautiful," I said, taking a sip of the hot tea, which helped steady my nerves somewhat. "That's a fine way to put it. Beautiful it most certainly is, but beauty also comes with a lot of pain. It's treacherous in this part of the world, especially in the winter months. It's not an easy life by any manner of means, I can assure you." "Well, why would you live out here then?" I asked. "Something in here," said Connor, pointing directly to his heart. "It's hard to explain, really, but I need to be in nature. I need to be with the birds, the bees, the wild animals, the mountains. It makes me feel intrinsically alive. In a city like New York, where my sister lives, well, I would be lost there. Here I'm at peace, content, very happy. I like the way life flows over here. It's smooth, peaceful, cathartic." "I think I get it," I said. "What's your name, boy?" asked the man, his steely eyes now focusing on my face. "Weston Finnegan," I said. "I guessed as much," said the man. "You're Julia's son." "That's right," I stammered. "Me and your mother, we go way back. I met her once at a friend's barbecue in New York, Upper Manhattan, where I was living at the time. Your mother, she stole my heart, shall we say. I fell for her, hook, line, and sinker. I was very glad when she ended things between us. As the way things were going, I was seriously beginning to think I could not live without her. I knew there was another man in the picture. Of course, she didn't know I knew all about him, but I did as much as I assume he must have known about me. I don't think your mother could decide between the two of us. Should I go for the Boston cream pie or for the Danish pastry? When your mother called off our relationship, shall we say, in my gut, I knew she was pregnant. It was a hunch of mine, a very big hunch, but I figured out she decided that I wasn't a keeper. I can't say I blame her, really. She knew I was a wild man. To settle down with me indefinitely would mean settling down to this kind of rugged lifestyle off the beaten track. I knew it wouldn't be fair on her to live a rough life like this, for it's not for the faint-hearted, and let's just say Julia loved to surround herself with luxuries. So you know who I am, then? I suspected for a very long time I might have a son or daughter. My sister passed your mother in Walmart one day, stopped dead in her tracks when she saw you standing next to your mother at the shopping trolley. I think you must have been about 8 at the time. She knew at once you were my son. You were the splitting image of me when I was your age. I can see what she was talking about, for when you got out of the truck earlier, I thought I was going to pass out from the shock. Looking at you is like looking at a younger version of myself. It's very disturbing. And you chose not to say anything? Well, what was the point? By all accounts, you were happy. You had a father figure who loved you as his own. Why would I want to come along and pull the carpet up beneath your feet? What did I have to offer you, anyway? I also knew that when you were older, you could come and find me yourself. And it seems I'm right. Here you are. Is that why you didn't ask me any questions when I said I needed to see you about a delicate matter? Yes, I knew it was you. It had to be. I've been expecting you. It's very good to finally meet you, son. My father and I were getting on so well that it was decided I was to spend 2 weeks with him in the wilderness. But it was on the second night of my stay that I was awoken to hear my father talking to someone. I remember thinking it was really odd, because there was no one to talk to out in the remote woods of the Alaskan wilderness, and my father was a man of few words anyway, and it was very unlikely that he would be speaking to himself, so I crept out of the kitchen cautiously and peeked out of the door onto the wraparound porch. And what I saw was so astonishing, I seriously doubted that I was even awake. I had to be dreaming, I thought. This couldn't be real, could it? For sitting there on the floor of the wraparound porch, with his finger dipped into a large jar of peanut butter, was a Bigfoot. As a young boy, I had loved books about Pooh Bear, with his fingers tucked into a jar of honey. Well, this creature was revelling in the peanut butter that dribbled and draped his fingers in curtains of caramel-coloured goo, which he scooped into his mouth with so much appreciation that it was almost comical to watch. "Is that nice, Hodge?" came my father's voice. "Is that nice? I knew you would like it." This anomalous creature was possibly more at home with my father than even I was at this stage of our relationship. I sensed he was a juvenile based on his behaviour, but this thing was huge. And when I say huge, I mean huge. It looked remarkably human, with ape-like influences to its appearance, most notably seen in the long arms, the pyramid-shaped head, and the long, dark, flowing brown hair that swathed his entire body. I noticed he was looking at my father with comical, deep-set dark eyes, and appeared to be chattering away so very fast in a language that I couldn't understand, as if he expected my father to understand everything he was saying. All of a sudden, the Bigfoot's body straightened like a pencil. His torso and legs started to stiffen. His head swiveled around in my direction. His dark eyes bored into mine. For a moment our eyes were locked in a stare. The creature then bolted away, so very fast, the jar of peanut butter still in his hands. "Oh dear," said my father, seeing me standing in the doorway, looking startled out of my skin. "I think you scared off poor little Hodge. He's not used to strangers. He's a very chatty, gregarious character. Always talks non-stop. But he's not accustomed to people, with the exception of myself, you could say. I suppose I've grown on him. He has learnt to trust me over the years. But you're a whole new phenomenon for him. He's not sure he can trust you." "A Bigfoot," I stammered. "A Bigfoot? You're friends with a Bigfoot? I'm from New York. We don't even believe the fictitious creature is real. I feel as if my view of reality has been seriously shifted. I never envisaged a Bigfoot could possibly be real. I thought he was a mythical creature of legend." I said this, grabbing a chair, holding on to it so tightly to prevent myself from collapsing from the sheer shock of it all. "You're going to be all right, aren't you?" asked Connor. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I just can't get it. You're friendly with a Bigfoot." "I am, as it happens," said my father. "Very friendly with little Hodge. Although he's not so little, is he? I mean, the creature's easily over 7 foot tall. Probably 500 pounds or more. And he'll be getting bigger when he begins to fill out, that's for sure. But now that he knows you're here, I doubt I shall be seeing him for a little while. He's a very evasive fellow. His kind always are. Like to be left alone, not bothered by the human species. Don't trust us an inch. Can't say I blame them. I'm like that myself, so I guess we get on very well with each other. We kind of get each other, I suppose." "How did you get to be friends with a Bigfoot? How's that even possible?" "Well, I was chopping some firewood one morning when I heard a strange muffled sound. I remember thinking, what the heck? It sounded like a human being sobbing. It's like someone was terribly upset. Now, here in Alaska, with the Alaskan Triangle, all the missing people reports, you hear all kinds of strange things that go on around here. People in these parts over the centuries have claimed to see ghostly apparitions in the woods, strange lights, hear disembodied voices. When I heard that sound, truly I thought it was a ghostly apparition. There are no people in these parts, so what else could it have been? My curiosity was naturally elevated. I'm a very nosy person, so I was naturally drawn to the sound, and that was when I saw Hodge for the very first time. He was sitting there on a fallen log that was covered with fungi and mosses, looking desperately sorry for himself, as if the whole world had come crashing down upon his shoulders. I don't know why, but I moved towards him to see if I could be of some help. He was so human. He seemed so desperately upset. I really wanted to comfort him. I guess I didn't even consider my own safety at the time." "Why was Hodge so upset?" I asked. "Would you believe it? His little carcass of squirrel was completely covered in hundreds or thousands of carpenter ants. Hodge was very upset about this. His meal was now ruined. He was trying his level best to shake off all the ants off the carcass, but to no avail. Unfortunately, carpenter ants are very persistent, even against an angry Bigfoot." "But couldn't he have eaten the carpenter ants on the carcass? I mean, after all, it's extra protein. Why would he have been bothered about the ants? I'm sure Bigfoots would eat slugs and stuff like that. So why would ants bother him?" "Granted, carpenter ants rarely ever bite humans. They're not poisonous either. But I think Hodge wanted to enjoy his squirrel unadulterated. I could see his food was very important to him. He was desperately upset. He didn't like the carpenter ants on his squirrel, any more than you might not be partial to jelly on a peanut butter sandwich. I can't say I blame Hodge. I'm with him on this one. I dare say on every mouthful you'd possibly feel live ants that you didn't manage to swallow crawling around your mouth, tickling, nipping your gums. Not very pleasant. I remember looking at him and telling him it would be all right, and even if his dinner was ruined, I had some yummy peanut butter back at the cabin that he might enjoy. That was far tastier than any squirrel could ever be." "Surely he didn't understand what you said?" "Well, I must say my voice seemed to soothe him. I don't think he did understand me, but he did watch me. He was very upset, but I do think I calmed him down. He was so cute at the time, only about 3 foot tall, with the sweetest brown button eyes you've ever seen that melted my heart like chocolate. He was wary of me, but very curious nevertheless. Anyway, he kept a distance from me. So I went back to the cabin. I brought out a jar of peanut butter and another jar of honey. I put them far away from the cabin. I watched him eating the peanut butter. The transformation on his face was priceless, rather like the boy who pulled out an onion from his Christmas stocking, only to discover it had morphed into a dream toy train for him. The jubilant look on his face was just like that. I can assure you that Carpenter Ant-infested Squirrel was far from his mind as he tucked into the peanut butter with so much gusto. He regularly came back for more, day after day, week after week, month after month, until I brought the peanut butter right up to the house. It wasn't long before his wariness faded. He became very used to me. He's a rarely chatty fellow, loves to talk and talk and talk in a strange language that I don't understand. I'd be blowed if I know what he's actually saying, but boy, does he make me smile. I think he sees me as a friend. Sometimes he brings me a leg of venison or a fish. I've seen his mother around too, but I've only had a very brief sighting of her peeking at me from behind the trees. Bashful, shy, reticent she is, but she has grown partial to the peanut butter, so she's happy about the fringe benefits of Hodge's relationship with me. Otherwise, I'm quite sure she would discourage it. You know, it can get very lonely out here. It's good to have a human-like friend. Hodge is exceedingly human. More human than some people, I know. He's very good company, lots of fun, very intelligent. Do you think there are other people like you, I asked, people who have secret friendships with Bigfoot out here in Alaska? Oh, I'm in no doubt about it. I'm sure there are, but they're not talking. Who can blame them? Possibly all over America, if you want my humble opinion. I imagine others feel exactly the same as I do. I would never tell a cryptozoologist about Hodge. I don't give a stuff what they want to prove to the world about the existence of these creatures. Who cares? I have a friendship with Hodge, a friendship I want to protect, as I would do the safety of anything that I held dear. You're the only person who knows about my friendship with Hodge, and I would appreciate your discretion in the matter. Of course, I said. My lips are sealed. Anyway, if I did talk about a Bigfoot in New York, I'd probably be ridiculed. Why do you call him Hodge? Well, when I asked him his name once, his language is so peculiarly strange, I thought he said Hodge or something like that. So I decided to call him Hodge. I really like it. I think it suits him. It's a cheeky name. To cut a long story short, I had a fabulously wonderful trip to Alaska, and so began the most phenomenal relationship with my real father, who taught me to adore the natural world. I'm not a man that enjoys keeping secrets from my own family, so one day I told my father, who raised me, what I actually knew. I felt he had the right to know that I wasn't his birth son. Dad, I said, I've got something to tell you, but I'm not sure you're going to like it. I don't like the sound of that, son, he said. What have you done? It's not a question of what I've done. It's more what Mother did before I was born. My father crinkled his brow. What are you talking about? Dad, please don't be mad with Mum. She never will forgive me for telling you this, but I just have to. I can't keep the secret from you any more. I'm not your real son. Not by blood, anyway. My father stopped dead in his tracks. Relief flooded over his face. So you know. She told you. She actually told you. I never thought she would. You mean you know? You know that you're not my real dad, I asked, looking completely stumped. Well, I suspected as much after you were born, said my father. You didn't physically resemble me in any way. I sent off a hair sample of yours for a DNA test. I think it was 98% guaranteed that I was not your biological father. It took me 4 weeks to open that envelope. I guess I already knew the results anyway. But you didn't mind? Mind? Of course I didn't mind, son. Look what I've gained. I've gained you, a son. You're the best friend I've ever had. I'm hardly going to look a gift horse in the mouth, am I? As far as I'm concerned, I will always be your father. Biological bloodline or not, it doesn't make a jot of difference to me. Tears streamed down my face, tears of joy, tears of relief and hope. I choked up. But you'll always be my father. Does Mum know that you know about this? Of course not, son. I don't want to rub her nose in it. I've always loved your mother. Your mother was fickle in those days, indecisive about almost everything, including the men she dated. But when she announced to me that the father of her little bump was me, I accepted the responsibility immediately, even though I had suspicions that the child she was carrying may well not be mine. Oh, the webs we weave, Dad, I said. We complicate our lives so much with all these secrets. There's nothing complicated about love, son, my father said. I'm now a married man with children of my own, considering myself to be privileged to have 2 fathers. My Alaskan father, Connor, still lives in the Alaskan wilderness. And yes, he still has a long-standing friendship with Hodge. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it took me a long time to realise that something was wrong with me, that I was different to the other girls in my year at school. How I wanted to be exactly the same as them, congruent, indistinguishable, comparable, more than anything else in the entire world. But alas, it would seem that my lot did not favour me in this regard. I despised, loathed being strikingly conspicuous, poles apart, the one that stuck out like a sore thumb, like a black and white zebra in a field of shining black Frisian horses. Ostensibly it seemed that outer worldly forces beyond my control were at hand, seemingly more than a little determined to single me out, to be idiosyncratic, eccentric, and rather quirky. It would appear that even my genetic code dictated that my bizarre physical peculiarities did not go amiss, as wherever I went, I was always noticed. I was about 8 years old at the time, with a longing to belong, a yearning to fit in with my peers, to assimilate seamlessly in the group. When you're at that young age, the idea of being contrastingly different to everybody else was not agreeable to me, by any manner of means. It certainly didn't help that I was a whole foot taller than most of the other kids in my year, terribly gawky, with an unfortunate set of buck teeth that had inauspiciously, rather adversely, earned me the nickname Beaver from my father, Rabbit from an uncle of mine, while among the kids at school I had earned the less than illustrious name Pepper Longtooth. How I hated that, with a fervent passion. "Here comes Pepper Longtooth," the kids would say. "Pepper Longtooth, Pepper Longtooth, here comes Pepper Longtooth." I remember it hurt a whole lot. I used to cry about it all the time, wishing desperately that I could change my appearance. I shared these conspicuous physical disadvantages with a rotund, roly-poly kid in my class at school of Hawaiian lineage that was so round, buxom, podgy, that even her clothing had to be specially made for her. She had 3 chins that framed her paunchy round face like a set of layered, fleshy, angelic halos. But despite all the ample cushioning that generously upholstered her body so bountifully, she still had a perfect set of pearly white teeth, a very pretty smile, and a lovely set of dark brown sparkling eyes. Of course she was ostracised unfairly for her great girth, for wobbling down the passageways of the school corridor like a large duck. I would have traded places with her any day of the week, for I ascertained with a spot of furious dieting she could look halfway normal, as the fat on her body would probably melt away like butter. A bit of food restriction couldn't be that hard, nor would it hurt to go hungry for a while. But I was stuck with myself exactly the way I was, with no quick fixes in sight to redeem my unfortunate plight. I would be tall and gawky for the rest of my life, which I thought was grossly unfair, as even the Creator appeared to have discriminated against me. Talk about drawing the short straw. My mother would tell me tirelessly, "God made you this way, Pepper. Be grateful for it." I remember thinking I didn't like this God very much, nor could he like me for putting me in such a compromising situation to be singled out for indiscriminate teasing, which was not a loving thing to do to a young kid like myself, any way that you looked at it. As a kid, I wouldn't say I was unduly picked upon, but no one wanted to hang around the wobbly duck, or the tall, gawky kid with the buck teeth. I was wilfully excluded from the princess tea parties, of which I could never be invited, for princesses did not hang around with ugly giraffes with buck teeth, nor did they have fat waddling ducks for companions. So me and the wobbling duck, called Maria Maheleno, pretty much hung around together like a pair of oddballs, the misfits on the playground, so to speak, longing to be accepted, begging to belong, hoping to fit in. For us it all seemed like a fantastical dream on the horizon that was simply impossible to grasp. So from a very early age, I felt very alone in the world. Of course, I didn't realise that it would not only be my physical impediments that would be among my growing list of shortcomings to distinguish me from being grossly abnormal and different from the other kids at school. With a horrifying revelation, another strange peculiarity had surreptitiously arrived in my life like an unwelcome viral infection that I couldn't shake off. I was to discover that this enigmatic peculiarity, disguising itself as a gracious gift, made me even more less likely to conform to the status quo than ever before. Could things get any worse than this? It seemed that they seriously could. It all transpired on the day when me and my mother visited my grandmother in the nursing home, which was something we regularly did. I never enjoyed those visits to the nursing home, as my grandmother looked so disconnected to the world, so lost, so confused, so unsettled in her own skin, as she sat there on a wheelchair, staring vacantly into space like an empty shell on a beach. She had Alzheimer's disease that had progressed to such an advanced state that she didn't even recognise her own daughter, let alone me, something that was a source of great distress for my mother. I do recall feeling very unhinged, befuddled, somewhat bewildered, as all of a sudden during our visit on this inauspicious, mundane, rather regular Tuesday afternoon, in what seemed like a heartbeat, suddenly I observed my grandmother physically walking out of her own body at the nursing home. What the heck was going on, I wondered. It was like I was seeing her in two distinct parts, both carbon copies of each other, but both parts, although physically identical, were intrinsically very different. It made me wonder if I had some kind of double vision disorder, as my mother had talked about such a condition before, when everything you see is duplicated. Could this be what was happening to me, I pondered, when everything became double, like two yolks in an egg, and not one? The woman in the wheelchair looked like an inebriated drunk, intoxicated by the wine of her confusion. But the woman standing outside of her body, smiling warmly at me, seemed to know me exceedingly well, appeared lucid, compos mentis, astute, very indifferent towards the body in the wheelchair. "What's wrong, Pepper? You look like you've seen a ghost," my mother asked me. I stammered. What's wrong with Grandma?" My mother looked annoyed. She let out a huge sigh. "I know it's difficult seeing your grandmother like this, Pepper. It isn't easy for the both of us. But I told you it's the condition. Alzheimer robs you of your memory, so you keep drawing blanks. I doubt she even knows who or where she is, let alone who we are. We mustn't take it personally, sweetheart. I did warn you about this, and I did tell you that these visits were never going to be easy." "Yes, but Mum, why does she have two bodies?" "Pepper," my mother asked, putting her hands on my forehead to check my temperature. "Are you coming down with something, sweetheart?" she asked, looking concerned, her forehead furrowing in a deep row of curious wrinkles. "You don't feel very hot to me." "No," I stammered. "I haven't got a temperature, but—" "But what?" asked my mother. I decided to shut up, as there was no easy way to explain what was happening to me. I watched my grandmother's more alert body once again merge into the confused body in the wheelchair, finally settling down into it, becoming one with it, as if they'd never been apart. It was a weird thing to witness, almost as if she'd walked into another room. My grandmother's eyes for a fleeting second showed recognition when they looked directly at my mother, as if a light had gone on in her mind. "Fee," she said, looking at my mother with an adoring expression upon her face, "it's really you! Oh, how lovely to see you, dear!" "You too," said my mother, grabbing my grandmother's frail hand, squeezing it very tightly, the tears clinging to her eyelashes like twinkling opaque jewels. "You recognise me, Mother," she gasped. "You actually recognise me." She was almost choking on her words. She was so deliriously happy. "Recognise you, dear? You're my daughter. Why wouldn't I recognise you?" In what seemed like a second in time, my grandmother's clarity drifted away as quickly as it had come, like the spiralling smoke from a chimney dissipating into the ether, so that the inscrutable, vacuous, poker-faced expression on my grandmother's face returned, settling comfortably onto her skin, as though it had never left her, soon accompanied by the glazed, dead fish eyes, the catatonic, inanimate, wooden dough-like appearance that we had become so well acquainted with of late. "Did you see that, Pepper? Did you see that?" chuckled my mother, her face so wild with excitement. "You could have been forgiven for thinking that all her Christmases had come at once." She grabbed my arm exuberantly, a flushed pink colour dappling her white face, while her blue eyes sparkled with a joyous glee. "Your grandmother recognised me! She's in there somewhere, Pepper." My mother began to sob as she held the old woman's hands ever tighter, hoping desperately to enjoy the benefits of another spot of recognition. But sadly she was to be disappointed. My grandmother's head swivelled round, white curls jiggled around her face, while her impassive, expressionless blue eyes turned to face my mother. She snatched away her hand fast from my mother's clasp, her eyes growing indignant and almost savage. "Who are you?" came a squeaking voice emanating from the back of her throat. "Who are you? I don't know you. I don't know you. Who are you?" "I'm Faye, Mother. Remember, your daughter, Faye. I'm Faye, your daughter." "Who are you? Who are you? I don't know you." "Go away! Go away!" "We're going now," Mum assured my grandmother, planting an affectionate kiss on the old lady's forehead. "Say goodbye to your grandmother, Pepper, will you?" I reluctantly, dutifully obliged my mother's request, kissing my grandmother's face. It was icy cold to the touch. It made me physically want to squirm. Before long we were caught up in traffic on one of Washington State's big roads. My mother seemed blindly oblivious to the physical mayhem out there on the roads, the chaos, the tension of the traffic. She seemed happy, tapping her fingers on the steering wheel in time to a hideous song that in normal circumstances she would have never normally enjoyed. My grandmother, having recognised her for just a fleeting second, had brought her an immeasurable amount of joy. "I knew she was in there," said my mother to herself. "I knew it. I just knew it." "Are you all right, Mum?" I asked. She looked sad but happy at the same time, as confusing as the weather when it rains while the sun still shines. "Oh, I'm all right, Pepper dear. In fact, I couldn't be better. I saw a glimpse of your grandmother today, a glimpse of her at the nursing home." All of a sudden, standing there in the middle of the road, caught up in the bedlam of hostile Washington traffic, was my grandmother in her white nightgown. I could see her standing there, larger than life, waving us down in the middle of the road, her face jubilant, her expression ecstatic, as if she had something quite wonderful and remarkable to tell us. "Stop! Stop!" I cried. "Stop!" But it was too late. My mother had pressed down the accelerator, driven right through my poor grandmother. I thought I was going to be violently sick. "You just killed Grandma," I said to my mother. "She was standing there in the road. Did you not see her? You drove right through her." My mother looked at me in astonishment, the colour draining from her face. "What on earth are you talking about, Pepper? There is no one there. Your grandmother's in the nursing home, for goodness sake. Are you sure you're not coming down with something? You're saying some seriously weird stuff today." In a trice my mother's truck was filled with the shrill sound of the crazy frog ringtone of my mother's seriously annoying cell phone. She answered it. "It's the nursing home," she whispered to me. "I wonder what they want." "Hello? Yes, that's right. It's her speaking. Yes, I'm her daughter. Yes, I only left a moment ago. Well, about 5 minutes back, that's right." My mother was silent for a moment, her face draining of colour. "I see. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know." "What's wrong?" I asked my mother. She looked at me like a gog-eyed goldfish. "Your grandmother. She died a couple of minutes ago." "You did see her in the middle of the road, did you?" I nodded. As you can imagine, although there weren't many events like these in my young life, there certainly were enough to make me realise that I was different to other people. Other people didn't have experiences like this. I could see and sense things others failed to see. I rarely tried to keep a lid on it, but there were times that despite my very best efforts, I would do or say things that would leave people questioning, pondering whether I actually had psychic ability or not. On one occasion my mother's godmother, Celeste Thunderin, popped over for tea with her little white dog, Trixie. She was a glamorous woman, with very large, puffed-up, whiter-than-white wavy curls that were perfectly set, pale, translucent, papery skin, very pretty cornflower blue eyes. She had very pillowy breasts and was always decked out in the most glitzy, glamorous clothes that looked like she only shopped in Washington's finest boutiques, like Betsy Fisher, D.C. Windsor, Saks Fifth Avenue, or Ella Rue. My mother always said she was the splitting image of the late romantic novelist Barbara Cartland. Even her white dog was not dissimilar to the illustrious author's very own, that was equally as cute and endearing. Everything about her exuded romanticism, abounding glamour. I loved it when Celeste visited us. She could turn the dullest, bleak, most miserable day into a sparkling, effervescent, bright one. I would hedge a bet that she could blow on a bottle of flat Coca-Cola, miraculously turning it fizzy again. The woman was dynamic, electric, a fireball, a sparkling flame of energy. But on this occasion, the normally flamboyant Celeste seemed unnaturally subdued. It was like she was cloaked in a veil of very sad, oppressive energy, as though mourning a grievous loss. She adoringly stroked her beloved dog, while my mother poured her a warm cup of tea in her most delicate china cups, the special ones with a gold trim that we owned. She knew no one appreciated drinking out of the finest china more than Celeste Thinderan. "What's wrong?" Celeste asked my mother, handing the woman her cup of tea, which she received so gratefully, her fingers trembling as she took a delicate sip. "If you don't mind my saying, Celeste, you're not your usual sparkling self. Usually you bring the sunshine into our house on a cold day, but this morning you've brought a heavy rain cloud in with you. What's wrong, dear?" "Is it that obvious?" "I'm afraid so," said my mother. "Please tell us what's wrong." "Well, my vet's diagnosed Trixie with an aggressive cancer. She hasn't got long left now. There's not much they can do about it. We just have to make her comfortable so that she can live out her last days in peace." "But she hasn't got cancer," I piped. "They're wrong about that. She's definitely not got cancer. She's not going to die. She's going to outlive you even, Celeste." I had lost complete control of my words, like the reins of a feisty horse. They had floated out of my mouth without any form of a filter. They could not be taken back or buried away with the squirrel's acorns, yet I knew them to be unequivocally true. It was too late. I had said them out loud. Yet I knew that Trixie did not have cancer. The dog was not about to die any time soon. It was a knowing I could not challenge or dispute, rather like knowing the sky is blue, the grass is green, and elephants have tusks. "Where on earth did that come from, Pepper?" said my mother. "You can see that Trixie is sick. You can't give Celeste false hope like this. You should know better than to say things like that, especially if they're not true, dear. How can you possibly assume to know more than the vets do? I assume that they've done all their tests, am I not right, Celeste?" Celeste nodded. "Forget I said anything, Mum." I could see that Celeste had discerned my very words. A new hope was born in her eyes, for she had learnt from my mother about my spouts of psychic revelation that had all come to pass. "Your daughter's an intuitive, Fay. Don't dismiss what she has to say. I've never known your daughter to make idle commentary for no reason at all. You yourself say that she's right about many things. Maybe she's right about Trixie. Oh, I do hope so." She said this, a light turning on in her eyes. In a trice the storm cloud left our house, as the woman who could turn Coke fizzy had returned in an instant. It was amazing what the power of hope could do. I'm glad to say that little Trixie got to live a long, full life, and yes, I was right. There wasn't a trace of cancer in her little body. And yes, she did outlive Celeste. We took her under our wings after Celeste passed away. How could I have known what I had known? I wish I could have the answer for you, but I didn't. Sometimes I just knew that I knew that I knew. It was when I was about 23 years old that I was recognised by the modelling industry as a girl that could make it big on the cover of magazines. I was highly sought after. What a turn-up for the books, I thought. Boy, how times had changed. The ugly duckling had become a swan. The buck teeth had vanished. The gawky thin body, appreciated by an industry that loves you to look stick-thin, half-starved, anorexic. I didn't want any of that superficiality whatsoever. It held no appeal to me at all. It seemed insipid, shallow, meaningless, flimsy. I wanted something rewarding, substantial for my life. So I decided to become a psychologist, as I adore helping people. I wanted to embark upon a profession with depth, substance, lasting intrinsic value. I wanted to make a big difference in people's lives. A big difference. I wanted to do what mattered. Whether my intentions to help people could be perceived on the other side by the recently departed, I am not certain. But one night I had a dream so vivid that I knew it wasn't a dream at all, but a visitation. It was a message. Of that I was in no doubt. A young girl wanted my help, and she wanted it now. The girl could have only been about 18 years old. She floated in my dream, her long dark windswept hair blowing around her face like those women in the L'Oreal adverts. She indicated for me to follow her, leading me through this heavily wooded area towards a beach-like clearing, around a shimmering silvery lake. This, of course, was in a dream state. I briefly glanced around at my bearings, recognizing them at once. It was an area outside Washington where my families would frequently camp when we went away on fishing weekends. The girl pointed to a spot underneath an old willow tree. "I'm there," she whispered. "I'm there. Please, please, I beg you. Please help me." I woke up with a start. The dream had felt so real. I could feel chills running down my spine, while my body physically began to tremble. I visited the local sheriff office immediately, but I could tell they were not taking my allegations seriously at all. If anything, they thought I was a silly young woman, possibly high on magic mushrooms. I even heard the deputy sheriff saying to another officer, "These bloody psychics, they're like mosquitoes, eating you alive at every turn. I wouldn't mind betting the girl's just looking for attention, making the whole thing up. The likes of her should be willfully charged with wasting police time." I could feel the angry, bitter bile rising up in the back of my throat. It was all I could do to scream out in annoyance. "Do you really think I want to come here just for a bit of attention?" I thought. "You really think I haven't got anything better to do with my time than loiter around a police station like a noxious bad smell?" The deputy sheriff pulled up a chair to the table. He grimaced as he looked at me, as if the idea of taking down my details held about as much appeal as swilling down a glass of pond water filled with a bunch of wiggling tadpoles. "Look, sir, I assure you that I don't want to be here any more than you want to take down my report. I know you think I'm looking for attention. I assure you I'm not. Believe me, I would rather be anywhere in the world than in this pathetic station of yours. I'm doing it for the girl in my dream. I want to help her. She wants her body recovered." "Miss?" "The name is Pepper. I'd prefer it if you called me by my first name, sir." "Well, Pepper," said the deputy sheriff, clearing his throat, stroking his moustache reflectively, "you must appreciate we get a lot of people claiming to be psychic like yourself, leading us up the garden path with their speculation as to the whereabouts of a missing person. Seldom do we get good results, I have to say. Yet I will admit that on occasion there are exceptions to that rule. But exceptions, let me tell you. Nonetheless, you come here to this police station with just a lot of hearsay. You don't even have a name for us, for this so-called missing girl that you say has gone missing. Furthermore, you claim this whole thing was a dream. How in a month of Sundays can you expect me to take you seriously?" "Look, sir, all I'm asking is for you to go to the destination in question, dig up the location. It can't be that difficult. See if the body is there. It's not going to be a big job for you." "I'm sorry, Pepper, but as well-meaning as you are, and I'm sure you are well-meaning, we can't throw valuable police resources, expenses, public money to indulge your grim fantasy based on a dream. That is like building sandcastles in the sky. Credit us with a bit of intelligence, will you, girl?" "You mean it's just too much for you to actually go and send a single person, just someone, to the lake to dig in the area under the willow tree? I don't think it would be a vast expense for you. It would only require the resources of one man. Surely you could do it." "I told you," said the deputy sheriff. "I can't throw valuable time along with a plethora of taxpayers' money down an assumption borne about by a dream. In my business, Pepper, we deal with hard, cold facts and figures. Besides, there's no one fitting the description that's recently gone missing that you've given me, that I even know about." "Very well," I said. "I'll dig the spot up myself. Don't blame me, sir, if you're the one with egg on your face when I find her body." At that, I stomped out of the sheriff's office like a belligerent kid having a tantrum, while I could hear him heave a huge sigh behind me, as if to say, "Not another nut job. Isn't life hard enough without people like her tangling my hair with outrageous, nonsensical claims, not grounded on anything substantial? Where the heck do they find these crazy people? They come crawling out of the woodwork like clusters of nasty termites." It was not without a great deal of persuasion that I managed to lure my boyfriend Braden to the lake one Sunday afternoon in late autumn, about 2 days after I'd actually visited the sheriff's office. It was an exquisitely beautiful day, as the soft shadows of pretty ethereal light danced through the towering statuesque ponderosa pines and Douglas fir trees that fringed the outer contours of the water. It gleamed, twinkled, sparkled in the noonday sun, like a spectacular silvery jewel. It would seem that the voluptuous shapely contours of the tall trees, the fluffiness of the white cotton ball-like clouds, the blueness of the sky, shimmered on the surface of the silvery mirror, as if you were looking into the depths of a crystal ball. With autumn marching ever forwards, the scenic golds and reds brushed the escarpment in an array of warm, rich, vibrant colours that only added to the arresting allure of this almost perfect day, that would be considerably more perfect if we weren't looking for a dead body, that was. The rhythmic sound of the water babbling, the occasional splash of a feisty fish, the sound of a waterfowl flying above us with mallards quacking and barking in their raspy two-noted calls, the day couldn't have been more favourable, as it resonated with a warm ambience that spoke of picnics, long lazy soaks on a sun-lounger, and comfortable rambles in the brush. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" said Braden, retrieving a large spade from the back of his truck. "What if someone spots us digging around the lake? We're going to look very guilty, suspicious even, as if we're up to no good, as if we're hiding something, or bearing a dark secret." "No one's going to see us," I assured him. "I haven't seen a soul around here. It's a very private, secluded spot, which is possibly why the murderer got away in the first place with his insidious act." "So where did the girl in your dream say she was buried?" I could hear a sarcastic note in Braden's voice that denoted that he was having difficulty suppressing his cynicism and doubt. Much like the police, he thought my nonsensical claims were pie in the sky, but at least he was humouring me. I could deal with that, but I bit my lip all the harder. I walked around a couple of willow trees to the far edge of the lake. Then I could hear a whispering voice like a soft wind saying to me, "Here, here, I'm here." I could feel the deathly cold chills going down my spine. I sensed the presence of the young girl. I couldn't see her, but I could feel her presence, and it was very strong. "It's here," I said. "It's definitely over here. I can feel her. It's very strong over here." I pointed at some sand not far from the river's edge. Braden began to dig, surprised that the ground was not as tight and compressed as it should have been. It was hard work, so sweat was pouring down his face. He decided to take a break, so we went to sit under an adjacent tree not far away from our digging site to eat our sandwiches together. Then the strangest thing happened. We saw this dark, sultry silhouette moving through the trees. The way it walked was as if it was floating above the ground, like a spectral being. You could be forgiven for believing you were seeing a ghost, or a demonical being, based on its dark colour. Me and Braden were so astonished by the anomalous thing that thankfully appeared blindly oblivious of our presence. We knew it wasn't a bear, for this creature stood up erect, tall, straight, towering well above your average black bear, larger even than a grizzly. When it moved its arms backwards and forwards, it almost appeared to be swimming on dry land. Its feet went bouncing across the ground in 5-foot strides, creating rumbling drum rolls or booming impressions beneath the earth's surface. Everything seemed to heave and groan and vibrate under the creature's weight, for it was very sizable indeed. "What the heck?" whispered Braden, who had stopped chewing his sandwiches. His frightened, nonplussed eyes were now firmly fixed on the creature. "Shh!" I whispered. "You don't want him to see you." "But what is it?" asked Braden. "What the heck is it?" "I think it might be a Bigfoot," I whispered. "Surely not," said Braden. "Surely not." The creature was now only a few feet away from us, but me and Braden had wisely ducked under some high ground cover to avoid being seen. On closer inspection, I was in no doubt that this was indeed a Bigfoot. It was examining the hole that Braden had just dug. We watched him scratch the pointed tip of his pyramid-shaped head, with a look of confused bewilderment in his deep-set dark eyes. It was as if he was saying, "What the heck is going on over here?" He even lifted up Braden's trowel that was perched up against the tree, running his long big hands down the hefty metal stem. The furrowed ridges on his sloped forehead visibly began to deepen. On hindsight, Braden is absolutely certain that the Bigfoot was about 7 to 8 foot tall. You see, I'm not good on things like that. 600 pounds and about 3 feet wide across the humongous, well-developed shoulder area. I noticed the Bigfoot had a tiny, inconspicuous neck that gave you the distinct impression he had no neck at all, but he did. His arched head was slung low upon the shoulders. I discerned that his face was like a man, strikingly masculine, with a powerful, strong, square jawline, deeply furrowed forehead, along with high cheekbones and deep-set dark eyes. We could see that the Bigfoot became very obsessed about something, like the dog on the trail of a scent of a boar. It was like the creature's aquatic nose was twitching vigorously, as if he had discerned an unusual smell, and was determined to uncover exactly what it was. He began frenziedly digging away furiously at the ground, like an eager dog looking for a long-lost bone. He moved his dig towards the right-hand side of the hole. He was using his overlong arms and huge hands to scratch at the ground, making light work of what appeared to be a laborious, unforgiving task. He used his large hands and the forward weight of his Herculean-sized chest to scoop up the soil, flinging it outside the open hole. He made Braden's attempts at digging look absolutely pathetic, but don't tell him I told you that. Jokes aside, it was clear to see that he knew he was on to something. We watched in horror as he pulled out a body from the ground. In his hands the limp remains looked like a fragile doll. It was a female that appeared bloated, puffed, recently deceased. We were suddenly hit with the most repulsive, rancid scent of death and decay that filtered across the valley, giving me a desire to hurl up the contents of my stomach. The Bigfoot knew the body was deceased, but nevertheless he looked at it earnestly. He began to hope against all hope, by vigorously smacking the face as though trying to rouse it from its eternal slumber. But the deceased limp body of the girl remained unresponsive, very fixed. The Bigfoot clasped his hands on either side of his head, letting out the loudest ear-piercing, discomposing wail. A scream that was so loud it would have made glass rattle. It was that shrill. It certainly sent the fear of God into every single cell in my body. It took a while to recover from those hair-raising sound effects, as their murderous intensity and tone was really off the charts. The Bigfoot, with a conquered, rather resigned expression of defeat on his face, glanced one more time at the deceased corpse, a deep sadness resonating in his eyes, as acceptance overcame his reasoning. Then he glided back into the clusters of ponderosa pines that framed the furthest corner of the lake, without even looking back once. "You were right," said Braden. "There was a young girl buried there all the time. I'm so sorry to have doubted you. But I'm a skeptic about things like this." It would seem that the sheriff, rather like my husband, was not exactly relishing the plates of humble pie I was serving him up. Even so, he was remarkably civil about everything, and very appreciative. "Well, it would seem you were right about the dead body of the girl," he said. "I must say I'm very impressed. I'm sorry to have doubted you, Pepper, but there are lots of kooks out there. We need now to uncover the manner of death. The coroner will be able to establish that. And now we also want to understand why the murderer wanted her dead. I'm hoping that your psychic impressions will help us establish some brand new leads." In the nights that followed, the murdered girl came to me in my visions with flashbacks relating to the day when her life had so callously been demanded from her. I would see a man in his early 40s with brown hair tied up in a limp pigtail, wearing a white string vest. In my vision he was screaming at the young girl, who was screaming back at him. "I saw you," she said. "I saw you! I saw you!" She turned around to me in my dream to address me personally. "He cheated on my mother. How could he? He promised he would never hurt her, like my father's done to her. My dad broke her heart. He's doing the same. I need to tell Mother. I need her to know exactly what a snake he is." I knew he could not be trusted. I knew it. "I'm going to tell. I have to tell. Mum deserves to know the truth. She needs to know who you are." I saw a flying pan take flight in the air. The man rushed forward, catching it in his hands, slamming it against the girl's head with a thunderous pounding force. I watched her fly backwards, her head hitting the ground hard. She wasn't dead. She was only dazed and confused. He stood over her, leering at her with belligerent, furious eyes. No one is telling anyone anything, if I have anything to do with it, he said, slamming her on the head again and again and again with the back of the cast-iron pan, as if he was crushing some garden snails beneath it, until he was absolutely certain she was dead. This time, when I visited the sheriff's office to report my vision, I did not receive the previous disdain as before. There were no sniggers or whispers in the background. Instead, I was bustled into a police interview room. The sheriff wrote down my account of what had happened. His face serious, he hung on to my every word, as if it was a gold nugget of information he couldn't afford to overlook. I was given doughnuts, Coca-Cola, made to feel as if I was valued as a witness, not a silly little girl with my head stuck in the clouds. "You've got quite some gift there, Pepper," said the sheriff. "I'm very impressed. I do hope you will help us with future investigations." "Well, I'm not like other psychics, sir, that help in police investigations. I got lucky in this case. The dead girl communicated to me in my dream. I don't know why she chose me, but she did." And so it was the stepfather was arrested. Finally he admitted to killing the young girl in an act of violent rage. He claimed the mother had been through hell in a previous relationship, and he had allowed himself to be seduced by a lady at the bar. "When my stepdaughter threatened to tell my new wife about my philandering, it just pushed me over the edge," he exclaimed. "I guess I just lost it." I noticed the newspaper reports described a dead body being found by the lake in a shallow grave, which I assure you was not shallow at all. Of course, there was no mention of a psychic involved in the case, nor a Bigfoot, but then again, why would there be? I mean, who would believe such idiosyncratic claims? So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, in a quiet, subdued, charming, prepossessing country town in North Carolina, nestled in the heart of a beguiling pretty valley, set up against the twirling shapes of the mountains that rise up in the sky in an ocean of soft undulating waves, was a very cosy, close-knit community of like-minded convivial people, a charming, endearing, welcoming southern hospitality that would warm up the cockles of the coldest heart. It would seem that at first glance, when enjoying the wondrous spectacular views over our town, you could easily be forgiven for thinking that the pretty curvaceous faint blue and purple smudges painted on the horizon, the quintessential landmarks I knew so well, had been applied with the skilled tweak of an artist's brush, for they were so subtle, the soft contours only adding to the lure of this transfixing space. The charming, whimsical town was where I was raised by two very loving parents, the magical place that I was privileged to call home. Indeed, if that wasn't enough eye candy for you, adding to the scenic magnificence, rather like the exotic spices to a delicious Christmas cake, were the viridescent spectacular greens of the wood groves that swathed the countryside in a kaleidoscope of bushy, tall, medium-sized trees that were clustered in ubiquitous congenial groups, from cypress, sweet gums, hickories, pines, red maples, and oaks. The species of trees as varied, unique, and resplendent as the landscape itself, that was decadently teeming with an abundance of indigenous wildlife, along with some well-marked hiking and horse-riding trails that were frequently used by the locals and regular overseas visitors to our neck of the woods. Yet in this beautiful, unassuming, safe country town, a predator was at bay, lurking in the dark shadows with the stealth and cunning of a leopard. His slight figure normally cloaked in a hoodie, so that his buried, well-concealed face was literally lost in a sea of black material, ensuring that his identity would be as vague, indeterminate, obscure, and blurred as the clothes themselves. He would slip into the dark shadows like a ghost in the night, disappearing from sight, lost off the radar like a ship at sea. Forget the Scarlet Pimpernel. This man was elusive, like a leopard, as slippery as butter, as hard to catch as a feral cat. The mysterious, featureless stranger was described as wearing an unremarkable pair of black jeans, a mediocre bomber jacket, a very run-of-the-mill standard pair of combat boots, which left you none the wiser as to who he could be, for indeed he could be anyone at all, who would fit such an abstract, nondescript, prosaic, faceless, rather beige description. To all intensive purposes, the sagacious, sharp-witted man of the night was as shrewd as he was savvy, perspicacious, calculating, insightfully aware of his surroundings. Every movement, every change of the light, every smell in the air, he knew it all, as if he had become one with the shadows, sinking disingenuously into their murky depths. But who was he? That was the question that lingered on everyone's minds, haunting their darkest nightmares, waking them up prematurely in the night, when a banging sound of a lone tree branch knocked against a window. In all likelihood, nerves were heightened, tension pronounced, energy depleted, drained, for no one was without concerns about the whispering wanderings of the night, for all were exceedingly sensitized to their awareness of the predator now in our midst. Indeed, it was true, people in our small town were troubled, very troubled, about this indeterminate, astucious stranger that was prowling our streets at the dead of night, with nefarious, duplicitous, iniquitous intent, a judicious vulture that was neither discerning nor discriminating in regards to his quarry. Outwardly it would appear that this stranger was fascinated by women of every age, culture, body type, so a woman in her 80s was equally as vulnerable as a young lady in her 20s, possibly even more so. But what did he want? What was his agenda? What was he doing in our small town? By all accounts, all these questions were flying in the air like the confetti from a confetti canyon, skyrocketing into the clouds, but answers to this enigmatic question were certainly not forthcoming. It was in the summer of 1964. I was 22 years old at the time. People in our little town were becoming increasingly on edge, ever wary of the scheming, duplicitous, ingenious, evasive and slippery predator. Verily, sightings of him loitering around like an offensive, hideously disgusting bad smell were most certainly on the increase, becoming uncomfortably too common. What would he do next was the concern among many. It would seem that hearts increased their beats, minds lost their sense of calm. Fear dangled in the doorways of people's homes like a menacing spiderweb that no one appreciated. Reputably, people's front doors that were once so generously left open were fastidiously locked. Windows were latched, fastened, bolted. The easygoing, convivial, fun-loving ambience of the town had faded away like a bird on the wind, for a tension hung in the air with an atmosphere so heavy you could have cut it with a knife. I was soon to learn that the mysterious hooded man had only recently been spotted, furtively looking into the windows of two vulnerable elderly women, who lived on their own in whimsical, enchanting cottages not too far away from each other. If that wasn't sordid enough, these poor old ladies had woken up in the middle of the night to find a creeping, tall, shadowy figure staring at them, looming over them, watching them as they slept, as if getting some kind of a rush from giving them the fright of their lives. As the late Sheriff Hugh Ingleford would always say, "There are many unhinged people in this world whose motives and actions may be as mysterious and unexplainable as the Bermuda Triangle." This, he believed, was one of those cases, something unfathomable, nonsensical, that left you with more questions than answers. The two old women's accounts of the incident in question were almost like carbon copies of each other. They had been sleeping, sensed a presence, felt as if someone was watching them, looked up from their beds to see these beady eyes hovering over them like a bird of prey from only feet away. They had screamed in terror. The man had vanished. Beautifully, despite intensive interviews with the sheriff, all that was revealed about him was no more enlightening. The hooded figure was dressed in black, his face obscure, his dark eyes beady. That certainly didn't give the police much to go on, because, put simply, he could be anyone or anywhere. I was working for the sheriff at the time, on and off as a police artist, where I was expected to draw up pictures of suspects from people who had randomly encountered someone of interest that could be a potential suspect in a police investigation. I had subsequently been called around to the sheriff's office to draw up a close picture of the mysterious hooded man, whom had been witnessed close up and personal, so at long last we were closing in on the mysterious stranger. Maybe now we might get some much-needed answers, as a close-up visual description of the man is what everyone had been praying for. As the story goes, the young man, on returning home from the local bar on foot, had stopped dead in his tracks when he'd seen a dark figure peering in the windows of his younger sister's bedroom, which was somehow overshadowed by the imposing presence of a Bradford pear tree. It was at about 6 o'clock at night, but with the outside light of the house still on, along with the bright luminescent full moon, along with the sparkling clusters of silvery stars, the visibility that night was excellent. In his eyes there was no mistaking what he'd seen. He realised at once that this was the town's elusive Peeping Tom that had brought a rural town crumbling to its knees. "Oi!" he called out. "Oi! You here! Get here!" The man glanced up and on seeing the witness began to run away, with the witness in hot pursuit of him. "Oi! Stop! Stop!" Fortunately, he did manage to throw the man onto the ground, succeeding in holding him down hard with a strong, forceful grip, eagerly tugging down his hoodie to see if he recognised the stranger's face. Regretfully, he did not. In a trice, after a big blow to the guts, with a very forceful, pounding, backbiting punch from the hooded stranger, the witness had been momentarily disabled, whilst the young man had risen off the ground with a buoyant jump and made his illustrious escape. Needless to say, this new surprise witness was invaluable to the sheriff in shedding some fresh light on this bizarre, erroneous and baffling case. "This is Michelle," said the sheriff, introducing me to the witness, a man called Michael Ambleflaw, who studied me with interest. "She's our artist. She'll be able to draw the face that you saw. The sooner we get his profile down on paper, the sooner someone might be able to recognise him. Even someone from out of town who might be able to know who the strange man is. Help us to get to the bottom of this very indecipherable case." I nodded. "I hope to be able to do a good job," I said. "Did you get a good view of his face?" I asked the young man. Michael nodded. "I do believe so. A very distinctive face, not one I think I would forget in a hurry. But it wasn't a face that I've seen before, so I reckon he's not from around here. Otherwise, he would look familiar to me." "I'll leave you to it, Michelle," said the sheriff, as he watched me settling down at the table with my drawing pad and pencil. "I'm in no doubt people will sleep a lot better in their beds at night, the sooner we catch this imbecile." "Do you mind me asking you a few questions? You see, as an artist, I need to get a full impression of the man, not just a physical one, if you understand. I know it sounds strange, but it makes my picture flow more easily if I have a greater sense of him. It makes him become more alive in my mind's eye, reflects favourably on my sketches. You spotted him when returning from the bar with friends, is that right?" The young man nodded. "It was a spot of luck, really, that I noticed him at all. You see, the Bradford pear tree is literally feet away from my sister's bedroom window. There was a little wind that night, so the graceful branches of the tree were swaggering. I remember thinking the tree looked inebriated, just like I was feeling. I'd drunk a little too much that evening. It was a private joke that I was having with myself, for let's not kid when you're tipsy. The strangest things can be terribly funny. Well, in my peripheral vision, I saw a solid, substantial movement at my sister's window. Oh, it turned my blood icy cold. It alerted my senses to the realization that something was wrong, very wrong. My eyes quickly darted towards the tree. I looked through the branches. That was when I discerned the dense silhouette of a man in black. If I hadn't been looking so intently, I doubt I would have seen him. His dark clothes made him very inconspicuous. I didn't have to think twice about it. I knew at once he was the Peeping Tom that everyone is so flustered about of late. Rightly so. There's something not right about the man. He's clearly unhinged, lost his marbles. Even when I saw the man up close and personal, I got that kind of intuitive feedback about him, let's just say. When you say he was loitering around your sister's window, did you actually see him peering inside? Oh, I saw him peering inside, all right. He was having a jolly good look. I'm convinced he saw my sister undressing. The lights were on in her bedroom. She would have been lightly turning in for the night, getting attired into her nightdress. It would have been a very vulnerable, inauspicious moment for her. Does your sister know about this? Are you kidding? Of course not. I would never let my parents know about this. They wouldn't cope with such knowledge. I informed the sheriff not to breathe a word of this to them, or it would distress them immeasurably. As for my sister, it would freak her out, especially if she knew someone was spying on her. It would make her paranoid. The last thing I need is for my family to stress out. People in town are all very wound up of late. One doesn't need to add fuel to the fire." "What do you think he wants?" I asked. "Isn't it obvious? He's a pervert. No doubt about it in my mind. My sister's pretty, but I gather he's been loitering around old ladies' houses as well, like a noxious bad smell. Goodness knows what the man is after." "What did he look like?" I asked. "Well, he was young, about my age, maybe a little older, possibly 21 or 22. He was slender, built, I suppose, tall, an olive complexion, deep-set dark eyes, very thick, buoyant black hair. He looked as if he could have some Italian lineage, I imagine. A very striking Roman nose. And, yes, well, a railway track raised scar under his eyes, just over here. It had become quite white as opposed to the rest of his skin. It would be exceedingly easy to spot him a mile off if you saw a scar like that, for it sticks out like a sore thumb." "Unless, of course, he managed to cover it up with makeup," I suggested. "I hadn't thought about that," said the man. "I suppose that's a distinct possibility, especially if he knows people are looking out for him." Once I'd finished drawing the sketch, I showed the witness my picture. "That's him," said the man. "I can't believe it. It's actually him." It must have been a couple of days after drawing the police sketch, when I was in a local coffee shop having coffee with a girlfriend of mine, that something aroused my attention, as the picture of the Peeping Tom was hanging in my mind like a brand new outfit that I couldn't stop thinking about. Indeed, I couldn't think of anything else since I'd applied that pencil to paper. As usual, the conversation that morning veered towards the Peeping Tom in our town, who was robbing all of its citizens of a good night's sleep. The men were worried about their daughters and wives. The women were concerned about their safety. Presumably all sensed that in a matter of time the Peeping Tom could potentially morph into a rapist or murderer. Many women, young and old, trembled every night when they switched off their lights, ever mindful that looming in the dark shadows was a predator waiting to strike if given half a chance. "I'm just so glad a witness has finally stepped forward, that you were able to draw a picture of him," said my friend Sally, sipping her coffee reflectively. "It was exceedingly brave of the young man to pull off the peeper's hoodie. Fortunately, he got a good view of the anomalous stranger, which is a flying start for everyone. The good news is that with a scar like that under his eyes, someone is bound to spot him sooner or later. I mean, the pictures of him are all around town now, on every telegraph pole. But no one seems to know who he is or where he's from. That's the strange thing about it all. I mean, what ails a young man like that to go peeking on women like this, especially old vulnerable women? Even so, by all accounts, he hasn't really done anything wrong yet, has he?" "Are you kidding, Sally?" I snapped. "Of course he's done something wrong. He was watching two elderly women sleep. He broke into their houses in the middle of the night. I think he's working up the courage for upgrading his attacks from the benign to something infinitely more sinister. But he's not quite there yet. We need to catch him in time before his nefarious fantasies become acted out in our reality." It was in that moment I glanced up towards the delicatessens. I saw the lanky silhouette of a young man piling a couple of doughnuts into a brown paper bag. There was something about his mannerism, the swift movements, that got my attention. He seemed shifty, his eyes darting around the coffee shop to see if anyone was paying him any attention. They weren't. I couldn't see his facial profile closely enough. I needed a much better look. I excused myself from the table. "Where are you going?" asked Sally. "One of those doughnuts is calling my name. I'm going to get it." I moved willfully towards the tray of doughnuts on display, standing a hair's breadth away from the young man, who had turned his attention away from the doughnuts and was mindfully hovering over the cinnamon buns like a bee over a can of cola. In his hands was another open brown bag. It seemed he was wrestling with himself indecisively, whether to get 3 or 4 cinnamon buns, as the tongs in his hands seemed to waver. "I would make it 4. 4 cinnamon buns," I said. "You can never have too many. Besides, this coffee shop makes the best gooey cinnamon buns in town. The saying less is more does not apply in this case. I would say more is infinitely more preferable. The young man looked up at me for a second. His intense brown eyes met mine. Then I saw it. Granted, it was covered by a pale splash of makeup, 2 shades lighter than his own skin, but yes, it was the indisputable scar from my picture of the town Peeping Tom. I was in no doubt about this. I had found him. I could hardly believe it. The excitement welled up in my veins, while my heart began to thunder so fast in my chest. I was sure everybody could hear it. "You're probably right," said the man, placing another bun in his bag. "More is preferable." Then he headed towards the counter to pay for his baked goods. "Thanks," he said. I nodded, dashing over to the table where Sally was drinking her coffee. She looked up at me in surprise. "Where's your doughnut? I thought you said it was calling your name." "Oh, no, you haven't already eaten it, have you?" "Sorry, Sally. Let's take a rain check on coffee this morning. Something's just come up." "What? What?" I didn't hear her words as I darted out of the coffee shop and surreptitiously hid myself behind a telephone box in the street, watching, waiting for the young man to make his appearance. Then I saw him coming out of the shop, walking towards the bus stop, where he stood in line behind a couple of elderly ladies who were nattering away excitedly to each other about the latest Andy Griffith show. It wasn't long before the young man hopped onto the local bus, carrying in his hand a large white plastic bag, which I guess contained some of the baked goods that he had just bought. I was following close behind him, ever grateful not to be observed. I sat down on my seat, only to sense the brown eyes of the young man boring into mine like an angry buzzard. I noticed his expression looked dark. He wasn't pleased to see me. I waved at him cordially, putting on a cheerful smile on my face, feigning that I was equally as surprised to see him as he was to see me. "Who would have thought I'd see you again?" I joked. "It's such a small world beyond the bakery." The young man's face visibly relaxed. He turned away from me to face the front of the bus. He slouched back comfortably onto the seat, his long, lanky legs stretched out before him. He was the kind of person you'd hate to sit next to on a plane, for he would greedily steal all the legroom. I watched him opening the brown bag to eat one of his cinnamon buns, chewing it slowly as he glanced out of the windows as a few scant raindrops trickled from the darkening skies, splattering their pitiful deluge against the panes. The bus drove into the heart of the countryside, past exquisite green fields, tobacco, cotton and sweet potato farms, along with little barns and scatterings of pretty trees that clustered the landscape in verdant celestial gatherings, past a mesmerizing silvery lake that twinkled under the soft dancing light of the sun, rather like a reflectant silvery jewel. The young man tapped the bell to announce his desire to disembark. The bus ground to a stop, making that horrible squeaking psh sound when compressed air is finally released. It ground to a halt, waiting for its passengers to disembark. I raised myself off my feet to climb off the bus after the man. At this point I knew that I couldn't hide myself from him, so I got off the bus boldly, my head held high with a purposeful resolve. At this the young man looked heartily annoyed. "You again? If I didn't know any better, I'd think you were following me. What's your problem, lady? Who put you up to this?" "Of course I'm not following you. I live around here," I lied brazenly. The young man looked exceedingly doubtful. "There's not much human habitation around here, lady. No one gets off the bus here, but clearly you do, which is a turn-up for the books. It's remote out here, not a soul around for miles. You expect me to believe your tall, fabricated story? Lady, you're following me. I'd like to know why. I have a right to know. I smelt a rat the moment you started talking about those cinnamon buns at the coffee shop. I mean, who does that?" "That's where you're very wrong," I said, thinking quickly on my feet. "I happen to travel around in a Winnebago, if you must know. It's illegally parked around there, on that farmer's field over there," I said, pointing in the distance. "You shouldn't think the worst of people, just because I happen to get off the bus at the same stop as you did. I mean, why on earth would I be following you? The idea is ludicrous," I said, giving an exaggerated sigh and shaking my long mane of hazel-brown hair rather too vigorously. At this I proceeded to take a right turn, walking through the trees, nodding to him as I did, not daring to turn around as I walked forward, for I knew beyond question he was still watching me. Why I never felt apprehensively overwrought about what I was doing is something that boggles me to this very day. I think I secretly fancied the idea of opening the local paper, with the stark blazing headlines, "Fearless North Carolina girl valiantly discovers the whereabouts of the town Peeping Tom, leading to his arrest and to the resummation of much-needed peace to the local community." When I was sure the young man had been fooled by my fabulously guileful act, of which even I applauded, I was feeling marvellously impressed with myself. I hadn't even given anything away, but maintained my cool, despite his audacious interrogation of me. I was confident that he had been deceived by my act. I was beginning to secretly fancy myself as an undercover officer. I would be absolutely brilliant at the job. I turned around to retreat from whence I'd come, back onto the long red dirt road, with so many trees dotting the landscape on either side. I knew that providing I stealthily darted from one tree to another on the raised embankment, I could follow him easily under cover. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that this man was the town Peeping Tom, for that scar under his eyes, that was so badly concealed by a thin coat of foundation, was a huge giveaway. It had to be him. I knew it with every fibre of my being. I mean, who else could it be? He'd gone to such lengths to conceal his scar. If he had nothing to hide, then why would he do it? He knew he was a wanted man, that was why. Consequently, with my picture taking precedence over every telephone pole in town, he was running scared, possibly seeking shelter in a wooded area, lying low, camping rough. I meant to find out where his location was so that I could lead the police directly to him like the cat to the mouse hole. I watched the young man walk down the dirt road. He wasn't wearing his usual dark regalia. Instead, he was wearing a long pair of bell-bottom, slim-fitting faded blue jeans, a white polo shirt, while a patterned sports jacket was tied around his waist. He kicked the ground with his boots, occasionally stopping dead in his tracks to look behind him, as if he sensed that someone was watching him. I noticed he seemed unsettled, perturbed, even annoyed. He was definitely behaving like a man who had something to hide. As I was trailing him, I got the sense that I too was being trailed. Now I knew my imagination had to be playing tricks on me, yet I was certain something else was following me. I could hear a distinct rustle, the ominous sound of underbrush being crunched beneath heavy bipedal feet. It even felt as if the ground seemed to boom ever so slightly. I tossed my wavering doubts to one side, secretly chastising myself for having such a colourful, vibrant imagination. Once again the grey skies struggled to cry, as they sprinkled a few droplets of rain onto the ground, some hitting my cheek with a refreshing wetness, but then again, as quickly as it had started, the rain receded. I was ever grateful for such small mercies, for the last thing I wanted was to be caught out in the rain, for then where would I seek cover while waiting for another bus heading back to town, and that could take a long time. All of a sudden the young man turned around in the dirt road. He stood as still as a statue, his back as straight as a pencil, almost as if his senses had been alerted. He reminded me of a startled white-tailed deer that had picked up the scent of a predator on the wind. For a while he said nothing. His eyes scanned the terrain. He looked intently at every tree that fringed the embankment. Oh my God, I thought. He knows I'm following him. Perhaps I'm not so discreet after all. Maybe my masterful powers of sleuthing weren't so artful after all as I'd initially perceived. "I know you're there, lady," came the young man's voice. "You think this is some kind of a joke, following me like this?" At that I remained very still, hardly daring to breathe. But as I stood still, I discerned something else breathing in close proximity to me, so much so, in fact, that I could feel the vaporous breath on the back of my neck. Whatever it was, it sounded alarmingly like a horse. I was startled. I looked around my immediate vicinity, and standing about a foot behind me was the biggest hairy giant that I've ever seen. What the heck was it? I wondered in horror. I was so terrified, completely taken off guard, that I wanted to scream. But I realised that the creature's demeanour was playful, almost as if he thought my stalking the Peeping Tom was some kind of fun game of which he wanted to play an intrinsic part. I was astounded by his presumptions. I discerned he had a youthful, playful, jubilant energy, which suggested he was a juvenile. Yet how could he be? He was 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, for goodness sake. He was monstrously big, burly, strapping, exceedingly intimidating. In those days I'd never heard of a Bigfoot or even the abominable snowman, so I was flummoxed as to what he could be. I studied the creature through intrigued eyes. The fear I had initially felt dissipated like the smoke rising from a chimney. This creature was terribly friendly towards me, not possessing any aggressive tendencies that would lead me to feel afraid. Besides, he was remarkably human. The only way I can describe the gargantuan creature to you is that he looked like a wild man, covered in long flowing brown hair, with overlong arms, powerful legs, a pyramid-shaped head, and the face that was so human it was astonishing. Deep-set dark eyes, flat nose, square jawline, high cheekbones, sloped forehead. He looked as if Native American Cherokee lineage was coursing through his veins, for he had the look or appearance of a noble Indian chief, if you like. I could hear the footsteps of the young man approaching us, while the strange creature was indicating for me to hide. He was flustered, jubilant, excited, enthusiastic. His sparkling brown eyes absolutely thrilled, enamoured, like a kid involved in an exciting, fabulous game of hide-and-seek. I sensed he really thought that this was the most phenomenal game. Of course he did. I desperately tried to hide. I didn't fancy being interrogated by the suspicious young man again. I scrambled for cover, behind a tree, but my movements were clumsy, bumbling, uncoordinated. I slipped on a gnarled root, finding myself staring into the eyes of the indignant man. My worst nightmare coming to pass. This is not what I had anticipated. Brown, enraged, belligerent eyes bored into mine. I could hear a snorting sound from behind one of the trees from the strange creature, who was obviously finding the fact that I'd been caught out terribly funny. On reflection, I suppose his kind are so brilliant at hiding in plain sight that my fumbling inability to succeed in such a simple endeavour must have been terribly amusing to him. I think I get that. Lady, why the heck are you following me? There's no Winnebago, is there? You made all that up. You've been following me since you found me in the coffee shop. Who hired you? I know who you are, I said, wavering an accusory finger at him. I know who you are. Well, at least that's a start. Then finally you might start telling me the truth, woman. The name is Michelle, I corrected him. Well, at least you can finally tell me the truth, Michelle. Who hired you to follow me? Was it Millie Parker? Huh, I might have known. You can tell her for me that I'm not coming back. I never will. Tell her to leave me alone, to stop hounding me. I made my decision. I don't want to live with her. Get it? Tell her I'm old enough to make it on my own. She has no legal hold over my life anymore. I don't need her breathing down my back, for goodness sake. The woman has never been there for me. She thinks a touch of sobriety changes everything. Tell her I am tired of being stalked. I'm tired. I've had enough. Millie Parker, I said, gulping the air in surprise, as if I was choking on it. I don't know any Millie Parker. I don't know what you're talking about. So then, if it wasn't Millie who hired you, then who did? You're a private detective, right? If you don't mind my saying, you're pretty lousy at your job. I figured you were following me way back. You should possibly consider another profession. You're a pathetic sleuth. I could feel the anger and indignation rising up in my face. How dare you? I'm a very good sleuth. I found you after all, when the whole town is looking for you. I know exactly who you are. You're the Peeping Tom. That's why I've been following you. The police need to be informed of your whereabouts. You've been spotted prying into people's windows at night, watching women undress, in compromising positions. You're a pervert, the lowest of the low. What? Said the young man, the corner of his mouth twitching in amusement. You think I'm a Peeping Tom? I've heard everything now. I've been called many things in my life, but a Peeping Tom, that cuts the cake. What are you smoking, woman? I'm smoking nothing. I'm a police artist. I happen to know that you're the perpetrator. I drew you myself. Oh, I see. You're the one that drew those printed pictures all around town that have been posted up everywhere. I've got to admit, they do look uncannily like me. The resemblance is remarkable, but I assure you they're not me. I am not the Peeping Tom. But you have the same scar as the perpetrator, I insisted, pointing to the area under his eye. You're hiding the scar under your eye, concealing it with foundation. The Peeping Tom has the same scar. In my book, there are no coincidences. I hide my scar, woman. It's unsightly. And it's not a scar, if you must know, it's a birthmark. That doesn't change anything. All of a sudden, a couple of pine cones came flying towards us. "What the heck is that?" said the young man, stopping dead in his tracks, when the jubilant, delighted figure of the big hairy creature made his rambunctious appearance known. He was like one of those boisterous dogs, thumping around the place in an excited frenzy, obliviously unaware of the disadvantages and ramifications of his huge, monstrous size. The creature was not appreciating being ignored. The young man looked astonished on seeing the critter, so much so that for a fleeting second I seriously thought he was going to pass out from the sheer shock of it. His mouth hung open like a Venus flytrap. His eyes grew round like saucers. "Oh, my God! Oh, my God!" He began to run away from the creature as fast as he could, with me trailing after him, along with the hairy creature by my side, who thought this nonsensical game was getting better every second, as all the running, hiding, and screaming were exceedingly exciting in his book. All of a sudden I could hear the most deadly roar, as something was screaming blue murder from the woods. Whatever it was charging towards us like a herd of bison, beating, pounding, cracking the earth, causing the ground to heave, groan, and vibrate. In that moment, the ear-piercing, shrill, discomposing sound caused us to stop dead in our tracks, like when the music stops in a game of musical chairs. It was the most bone-chilling sound I've ever heard. It caused my blood to freeze over. The large, hairy, very playful creature became stoic and quiet. He let out a frightened whimper, as though scared or rather intimidated. It was clear he knew who was coming our way, perceived that he was in trouble, big trouble, from what I assume must be a belligerent parent. The poor comical creature begrudgingly glided away towards the sound, his eyes filled with disappointment. I could hear the angry background raised voice of a female, which I deduced must be the creature's mother, giving him a piece of her mind, possibly telling him to stay well away from humans if he knew what was good for him. The young man who I was to discover was called Ivan insisted on taking the bus right back with me to visit the police station to prove that he had absolutely nothing to hide and that he was definitely not the peeper. "I want to prove to you that I'm no Peeping Tom. Yes, I was hiding from my mother, Millie, who believes now that her days of alcoholic intoxication are behind her, that I should be there to entertain her during her sobriety, to help her while away the boring, monotonous drudgery of her daily life. She abandoned me when I was young. She never wanted me around, but now she wants me there all the time, to control my life. She refuses to allow me to have space or any independence. I'm far too old to be under my mother's clutches, but she appears to think very differently about the matter. I've run away a couple of times from her before. She's trailed me every time with a private detective on my back. So that was why I was lying low, camping out in the woods." As you can imagine, I felt like a complete idiot when a couple of weeks later the real perpetrator or Peeping Tom was actually caught. I certainly felt as if I had egg on my face. He was a mentally ill, seriously disturbed man who had run away from the mental facility, was fixated by women. He was on medication to suppress his amorous sexual urges. If he hadn't been caught in time, the stalking could ultimately have morphed into rape. When I saw the man's picture in the paper, he was a dead ringer for Ivan, with a similar scar under the eye. But I suppose weirder things have happened. As for the creature I encountered, it was definitely a Bigfoot. It was so funny how he stumbled up to me when I was trailing Ivan and thought it was all terribly exciting, rather like a fabulous game of which he wanted to partake. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the year was 1951. The atmosphere in this North American rural town in the Kentucky countryside was electric, buzzing, infectious, animated. Even the adults weren't unaffected or impervious to the arrival of the travelling circus that had burst forth on the scene like an unexpected, joyful surprise that stirred the cockles of every heart with a fervent enthusiasm that couldn't be abated or even moderately suppressed. Children everywhere were bubbling over with gleeful jubilation and hopeful anticipation, imagining what it would be like to go to the circus. Indeed, it would seem that this thriving rural community could talk of little else. I mean, after all, who didn't like the bright, flamboyant atmosphere of a circus in town? It would seem that from the bakery to the butcher, people stood on street corners as they watched in reverent awe, as the colourful, vibrant colours of caravans in pinks, purples, greens, yellows, blues and reds drove down the long ribbon of asphalt through the town centre, along with trailers supporting hefty wrought-iron cages containing exotic animals like tigers, bears, camels and a couple of adorable monkeys wearing T-shirts saying, "USA is best! USA is best! USA is best!" Then there were 5 very large elephants whom were beating their hefty feet down the street. People were applauding, cheering, clapping and whistling, while the circus folk responded enthusiastically by waving bright red, blue and white striped handkerchiefs at the bystanders, while some lifted up their bowler hats in a gesture of friendliness. Children were crying, "Mummy, Mummy, look, an elephant! Over there, an elephant!" Others were saying, "Did you see the tiger? There's a tiger!" Consequently, word spread around like a wildfire that a circus was now in town, and that exciting revelation could not be quashed. I mean, could it have got better than that? For my grandfather Bradley and his brother Easton, this was possibly the most exciting thing that could have ever happened in their entire lives. If that wasn't fabulous enough, the best part of it all was that the circus had set up shop in the meadows to the rear of the family property, which was not terribly pleasing to his father Eli, who didn't like the idea of caged tigers being too close to his dairy herd. Not only was he concerned that one of the tigers could escape, but Eli was convinced that his dairy herd was exceedingly unsettled, as they had caught the indistinguishable whiff of the tiger's scent in the air, and had become brazenly aware of the sultry predators in their midst. The ominous smell of tiger on the wind was certainly increasing their anxiety levels, reducing their milk yield quite considerably. Indeed, Eli had broken all the stops, even hired a local boy in town to play the flute for the cows while they were milked, for it seemed to settle their anxious nerves considerably, and they were particularly partial to Mozart's The Magic Flute, which was quite ironic, really. It was an added expense Eli would have sooner avoided, but if it calmed down his cows, it was worth the money. He was now more than a little piqued that his farm had to be banging loggerheads with a circus of all things. This was proving to be a god-awful nightmare, one he would have happily avoided, as despite being predisposed to a hot temper, Eli liked nothing better than keeping the peace. This endearing, charming dairy farm was where my grandfather was raised as a young boy, living with his parents Eli and Sheila, along with his older brother Easton, in a vintage pale yellow 1950s farmhouse with an attractive navy blue trim. It possessed a rustic old-world charm about it, despite the fact that it was modern for its day, was cheerfully tucked away in the heart of the Kentucky countryside, surrounded by exquisite panoramic views, verdant rolling hills, clusters of pretty trees, such as serviceberries, magnolias, cypress, beeches, plums, black cherries, pawpaws, and red mulberry trees. The name of the farm was High Valley Fields, and to access the farmhouse you drove down a windy pebbled road that was notoriously wobbly, so that your whole truck, no matter how robust, would jiggle and shake quite violently on your approach. On either side of Eli's farm were hedged-in areas of smart white wicker fencing, where there were bountiful pretty viridescent meadows clustered with trees where the black and white cows were seen grazing. Then there were barns, a sizable dairy, an area to park all kinds of farm equipment, and of course a select enclosure designed specifically for a very handsome bull that Eli had always loved. I gather his name was Starlight Promise, and boy was that bull one hell of a character. There wasn't a farmhand or even a cow around that didn't love his sprightly, upbeat presence. There were several well-stocked ponds on the farm, surrounded by a scattering of weeping willows that attracted a great deal of interest from the waterfowl, exotic bird life, and local indigenous wildlife. On the right-hand corner of the farm was a vast wooded area, comprised of towering, statuesque mature trees, with huge hiking trails that led directly to a back dirt road on the Upper East Side, while straight ahead it led to the neighbouring meadows, which were often filled with black and white Holster cows that belonged to the legendary farmer Mr. Bradstock, whom Eli could not stand. I gather he described the man as a ferret who had weasel eyes, whatever that's supposed to mean. Either way he looked at it, it wasn't meant as a compliment. As you can imagine, Eli was far from happy with the chaos and mayhem of a circus arriving in town. He made his misgivings very clear as he thundered around the farm like a bad-tempered badger. "My cows can smell those bloody tigers a mile off," he told his wife Sheila. "Why they had to set up shop so close to our farm, God only knows. I mean, all you have to do is walk through the woods to Mr. Bradstock's meadows. Wham, bam, there you are. Instead of seeing dairy cows grazing away happily, as you would expect in a meadow, there's a goddamn circus staring you in the face like a rude spot on the chin. Never in a month of Sundays did I ever envisage something so catastrophic happening like this. Huh, I wish to God that Farmer Bradstock hadn't agreed to let them use those bloody meadows of his. What the hell was he thinking? The countryside is going to be filled with booming, rattling sounds of a circus, annoying screams of overexcited, animated children, bloody roars of animals that belong in the jungles of India or the wilderness of Africa. Even our indigenous wild animals are going to get confused with the strange animal smells loitering around that they're clearly not acquainted with. You know, I wouldn't mind betting Farmer Bradstock did this on purpose to me. That man has always been jealous that my dairy cows are infinitely more superior, a hell of a lot more productive than his are. He's exceedingly jealous of my prize bull. When I won that award last spring, you could see the man was positively green at the gills. He was spitting like a king cobra. I could swear I could see foam emanating from the corner of his mouth like a rabid dog. Of course, he never congratulated me on my herd receiving first prize. No, that was just too much to ask for. The man didn't even have the common decency to pretend that he was even a teensy-weensy bit happy for me. Not a chance. You know, he glared at me. He had the blatant audacity to say that my luck was running out. I wouldn't hasten to bet he planned this all along, guilefully hoping that my cows wouldn't respond well to the arrival of a circus in town. That man, he makes my skin crawl. That smug smile of his is about as sincere as a politician's. You can't trust the man a bloody inch. He's a snake in the grass. Well, there's not much you can do about it, dear, said Sheila. I think it was agreed last year that Farmer Bradstock would let the circus use his meadows on our side. You've got to admit it. It's a perfect location, not too far from the town. Furthermore, I'm sure you're exaggerating about Farmer Bradstock. He seems a decent man by all accounts. Besides, everybody's excited about the circus. Why do you have to be such a wet blanket, so miserable about it, Eli? Can't you see how exciting this is for the kids in town to have the circus on their doorstep? Can't you at the very least just be a little bit happy for them? Because, woman, this is my livelihood. That bloody circus is upsetting my cows. Eli Langley was far from happy. He wandered around the farm in a huffed, tetchy state, as the elevated tension of his normal placid dairy cows had left him more than a little hot under the collar. Sheila sighed wearily. She watched her hot-tempered husband in his blue plaid shirt, bootlegged jeans and rubber boots, wilfully striding through the woods, his stomping legs expressing the level of his indignant rage that was coursing through his body at an alarming pace, rather like a threatening cyclone on the horizon, and heaven help you if you got caught up in the eye of this brewing storm. The warning signs that a landmine could potentially be about to go off in any second were very plain to see. She could see him mumbling all kinds of atrocious words under his breath that were not for delicate ears or for the faint of heart. In truth, she secretly felt a tang of pity for the ringmaster, whom she knew would be on the receiving end of her husband's cantankerous peevishness. She perceived that a confrontation with her husband would certainly not be pretty. A little like a bad-tempered, crabby Rottweiler meeting the neighbourhood pooch with that annoying squeaky bark. Sheila had been on the receiving end of her husband's wrath for many long years, and much as she loved him, he had a steamy temper on him that could potentially intimidate even a grizzly bear. if it was allowed to get out of hand like a Californian wildfire. As Eli stomped through the woods like a belligerent elephant, his mind was whirling like a tornado, his thoughts flying around him like loose plates at a Greek wedding. He arrived on the scene to see that Farmer Bradstock's meadows had miraculously transformed themselves into a bright, sparkling fairground. The whole crew of the circus, from the elephant handlers to the jugglers, were all lending a hand, bustling around in scattered groups, getting things prepared for the big opening day, when people from all over the Bluegrass State and beyond would be visiting the circus. He trudged wilfully over to one of the men that were erecting the largest blue, red and white striped canvas tent that he'd ever seen in his entire life, which even had fancy over-the-top torrents built into the canvas so that the humongous circus tent looked like a giant candy castle. This was the huge, blazing monstrosity that was clearly being used to accommodate the sizable audiences the circus was soon to be expecting. On the wind he could smell the disagreeable whiff of animal, manure, wood shavings, grease paint, sweat, and hot peanuts, along with the faint smell of caramel candy from the candy machines that were being erected everywhere. Even his dairy cows didn't smell this bad, he silently mused to himself, although the smell of the hot peanuts wasn't too bad. "Oi, you!" he said, pointing to one of the men pegging the tent with poles. "I need a word," he barked. "Where is the ringmaster? I must see him at once." "Excuse me, sir. A little manners might be nice," said the man, looking more than a little nipped by Eli's disagreeable curt manner. "Round here we try to talk nice to each other," he said, dabbing the sweat on his forehead with a handkerchief and looking at Eli with a disapproving frown. He pointed towards a tall, well-built man who was talking to a slender, athletic-looking woman with a long mane of blonde hair outside a pink caravan, who he was obviously flirting with unashamedly. "That's Barnaby. He's your man. Any issues with the circus? You talk to him, not to me." "Thanks," said Eli, mumbling under his breath, storming towards this Barnaby fellow, with about as much grace as a bull in a china shop. "Oi!" he called to Eli. "You're the ringmaster, is that right?" The man nodded. "Who's asking?" "I need a word." The ringmaster moved towards Eli, his muscular body stiffening in a fascinating uncertainty, as he reluctantly approached the pugnacious confrontational man, sensing that walking on a trapeze would be infinitely easier any day of the week than treading eggshells with a man who looked so explosive he might just actually breathe dynamite. "I have a big bone of contention to pick with you," said Eli, his heated, gravelly voice sounding raised. "I happen to be running a dairy farm a hair's breadth away from where you've set up shop here on this meadow. My dairy herd is very, very distressed. They can smell your tigers a mile away. They're not at all happy. What are you going to do about it?" The ringmaster shrugged his shoulders in a dispassionate, nonchalant way. "I'm sorry, but I have to make a living as much as you do, mate. There's not much I can do about the emotional state of your cows. I'm sure they'll settle down sooner or later." "Settle down? Sooner or later? I've heard everything now. Thanks a bunch. What's your problem? How can my cows settle down? Would you settle down in a river of crocodiles? Would you relax your tight little derriere in a nest of poisonous vipers? Oh, I think not. Look, I'm sorry, mate. There's not much I can do about the smell of my tigers, short of spray them with a deluxe odour cologne, and that would cost a pretty penny." At this he let out a chuckle. "That ain't going to happen, mate. Not in a month of Sundays, I'm afraid." "You think that's funny?" said Eli, his face growing crimson with anger. "You seem to get off scaring a whole dairy herd. Are you people not supposed to be animal lovers? I mean, you have horses, zebras, tigers, camels, bears and elephants. Am I not right? Are they just trivial accessories to your business that you blatantly abuse for your own ends? Yes, I've heard rumours about you circus folk. Nasty rumours about how you abuse animals all the time. That may be other circuses, but it's not mine. We're animal lovers," protested the ringmaster. "Everyone in my circus loves our animals. None of them are abused. My circus is my family. We never force our animals to do things they don't want to do, nor do we ever beat them. Everyone is treated with respect on my watch. The trapeze artists, the clowns, the animals, they're all family to me without exception. We're one big happy family. Really? Said Eli, raising a sceptical brow, as if he didn't believe a word of it. I think the man protests too much. For a moment the ringmaster collected his thoughts, placing a pensive finger over his mouth. Then a revelatory light came on in his hazel eyes. I tell you what, I'll bring my 2 tigers over to your dairy herd, to your cows, so that they can check them out for themselves. They will see for themselves that Phoenix and Maynard are very agreeable cats. Nothing to worry their sweet little udders about at all. Have you lost leave of your senses? Said Eli, his mouth dropping wide open, so wide in fact that he could have swallowed a dozen goldfish without even flinching. You think introducing your tigers to my dairy herd is going to calm them down? Are you loopy? Are you a half-cut, inebriated drunk or something? I'm not going to dignify your absurd suggestion even with a response of any kind. The phrase "set the cat among the pigeons" springs to mind here. To put it in a nutshell, my cows are distressed by your tigers. You think bringing your tigers over for a little congenial tete-a-tete is going to be a harmonious event? I think not. Well, I'm sorry. It's the best I can do for you, said the ringmaster, short of evacuating my tigers off the premises. Sorry, mate, but that just ain't going to happen. I have a business to run here, much like you do. Running a circus is no easy endeavour. Take it from me, if your dairy herd faces their fear head-on, they'll realise there was nothing to fear at all. Here at the circus we comprehend the enigmatic boundaries of fear better than most. Working in an industry like ours, we live on adrenaline. Taking risks with our acrobatic performances is something we do every day. Others wouldn't dare to contemplate such a thing. We tirelessly work with animals that could potentially snap off our heads or crush us under their trumpeting feet. But we do it anyway. You know, the one thing I've found about facing your fear is that it goes away the moment you embrace it. Then you realise your fear was unfounded. Why should it be any different for your goddamned cows? The principles are exactly the same. It works with horses you break in, as with any other animals. Why should your dairy herd have a monopoly on fear? Eli reflected on the ringmaster's words. Maybe he was right. Maybe he made a valid point. Introducing his cows to both the tigers could potentially lay their fears to rest. But the reverse could also be true. Very well, he said. But make bloody sure those tigers of yours are both on leads, and that they've eaten very well. If there is so much as a rumble in those stomachs of theirs while they're looking at my cows, there is no telling what I will do next. I'm warning you. What? Said Sheila when Eli returned home to tell her that the ringmaster was bringing the tigers around to the farm to introduce them to his dairy herd. What the heck is wrong with you, Eli? Are you bark raving mad, or as nutty as a fruitcake? I can't even decide which. You think bringing a couple of tigers into the meadow to introduce them to our cows is going to calm them down? Have you lost leave of your senses? More likely we'll have cows dropping down dead, left, right and centre from coronary heart attacks. Goodness only knows what the vet will say. I can even see the local papers saying cows all died of anxiety due to farmer introducing his cows to Bengal tigers. Even the vet will think you've lost your marbles, Eli. It's a risk I'm willing to take, sighed Eli. My cows are visibly upset. I can't sit back and do nothing about it. This needs nipping in the bud. Otherwise we could have some stillbirths on our hands and a host of other problems boiling up for us. I like things to run smoothly like clockwork around here. I had to find some middle ground with this disagreeable ringmaster who thinks that this little trick might just work. To give him his due, he does seem to know a thing or two about animals' psyche, as he's worked with them all his life, so I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. Sheila looked unconvinced. Oh, I hope you know what you're doing, Eli. My grandfather, who was one of Eli's sons, described the moment when two large Bengal tigers visited their farm as the most exciting moment of his young life. His eyes had twinkled as he described these magnificent cats being brought onto the ranch wearing large dog collars and leads. He said he was immediately drawn to Phoenix as the tiger nuzzled her head against his torso so affectionately, like a regular cat rubbing itself against his legs. My grandfather and his brother Easton asked the ringmaster if they might stroke the tigers, which they did. They were magnificent, their coats sleek and smooth. He said they watched in awe as the ringmaster, along with the blonde lady Miranda, who was also the ringmaster's girlfriend and an aspiring trapeze artist at that, both led the two tigers into the meadow like you or I would walk a couple of dogs. If the tigers were interested in the dairy herd, they certainly didn't show it on their faces, as they appeared indifferent, insouciant and apathetic. At first the rattled dairy cows scattered in terror, their hooves thundering into the furthest corner of the field, where they clustered together against the wicker fence in a tight, congested group, as their noses quickly discerned the scent of the predator, all too close for their comfort. Miranda, the blonde lady, sat down in the middle of the field, with Barnaby, the ringmaster, by her side, along with the two tigers who were rolling on their backs, rubbing the rough grass against their sleek coats, using it as a back-scratching post, and revelling in every moment of it, reminding my grandfather of the domestic tabby they owned that loved rolling in the dirt. The tigers were clearly unfazed by their new environment, and were happy to be frolicking in a farmer's field, obliviously unaware of the distress they were causing in a large herd of cows that were eyeing them warily from a distance. Slowly but surely one inquisitive cow moved forward, followed by another and another, until the ringmaster and Miranda were surrounded by a herd of inquisitive dairy cows, watching the two tigers with a curious, fascinated interest, chewing their cud as if eating buckets of popcorn at a movie theatre. Eli and Sheila were absolutely gobsmacked. "By Jove," said Eli, "the ringmaster was absolutely right. Those cows have lost their fear in a heartbeat. For all the tea in China, I never thought I would see that happen." As to which his wife Sheila responded, "Eli, I've seen many strange things in my life, but this takes the biscuit." Before long, the animosity Eli had held towards the ringmaster and his girlfriend Miranda had dissipated as fast as the smoke from a chimney. Soon the couple became established and firm friends. So began a lifelong friendship of note between them. Eli and Sheila regularly invited the interesting circus couple to the farmhouse to enjoy a swim in their swimming pool, often accompanied by the two tigers, who always appreciated a nice dip. This was after the circus had invariably wound down for the night. The huge throngs of people had finally left. They enjoyed escaping the circus to spend time with Eli and Sheila, talking about things beyond their life at the circus, while Eli and Sheila enjoyed hanging around with such exotic friends, so contrastingly different to the locals in town. The ringmaster's name was Barnaby Delisandre. My grandfather and his brother Easton warmed to him at once. He was good with children, had a great wit, keen sense of humour, and could be terribly funny, cracking jokes all the time. "Why is a marriage a three-ring circus?" he would say. "Engagement ring, wedding ring, and suffering. How do you kill a circus all at once? You go for the jugular. Ha ha! Why do circuses have rarely human cannonballs anymore? It's hard to find men of caliber. Ha ha ha!" Barnaby ran the travelling circus seamlessly, with a few hiccups here and there, following in his esteemed grandfather's illustrious, highly regarded footsteps. It was the only life he'd actually ever known. He was the one that would announce to the audience about the shows that would follow, which would include stilt walkers, acrobatic tricks, aerial arts, balancing acts, and of course various stunts with tigers, zebras, bears and elephants. Unfortunately, his first wife, Aphrodite, had sadly lost her life 3 years ago from an acrobatic performance that had gone badly wrong. He had blamed himself for the tragic accident, but the less said about that, the better. It was when my grandfather met Barnaby's daughter, he became weak at the knees. She was 14 years old, already an aspiring trapeze artist in the circus, as well as an elephant handler, but to my grandfather she was the most exotic, exciting creature he'd ever met. To look at, she was lean and athletic, with dark auburn hair, fair skin and pretty blue eyes. She was exceedingly fearless in every regard, as she embraced any challenges that came her way as an obstacle that could easily be overcome. There was no such word as can't in her vocabulary. My grandfather was immediately drawn to her fiery, effervescent personality that could also become stoic and calm. There were occasions when she was like a feisty current at sea, and other times she was mellow and chilled like a cool Sauvignon Blanc. Her name was Scarlet, and my grandfather told me, even though she was only 14 at the time, while he was 13, he decided without a shadow of a doubt that he was going to marry this girl one day. And of course he was true to his words, as the couple eventually got married in the early spring of 1962. And 4 years later I was born, on the 5th of July 1966, their oldest daughter, who they called Isabella Rose. When Scarlet came to visit the farmhouse regularly with her parents, she almost always brought along her elephant Marybelle, who was a gentle giant if you ever saw one. She would ride her back while my grandfather would climb up behind her. Together the romantic little duo would pad through the hiking trails in the woodgrove together. Thankfully the trails were spacious enough for a very large elephant to get by, although there were occasions when awkward areas needed to be tackled very diligently with an ingenious prowess to make way for the beast. My grandfather's brother Easton knew how he felt about Scarlet, so he generously gave the young couple some space to breathe, to spend quality time together, for it was clear that Scarlet was as beguiled about my grandfather as he was about her, for the romance between them was quite literally smouldering. I gather that even her father Barnaby had said, "You mark my words, those two are made for each other." One evening when the throngs of crowds had finally left for the night, and Scarlet had succeeded in dazzling the crowds with her phenomenal trapeze acts and masterful elephant handling, she and Marybelle came to collect my grandfather for the usual after-circus rendezvous. They decided to ride Marybelle in the woods, as on this specific occasion, armed with headlamps along with the light of a brilliant full moon, the visibility was absolutely excellent. In a trice the elephant began to behave strangely, as if she could sense an unfamiliar smell on the wind, something that had ruffled her feathers. She let out a loud trumpeting sound to express her extreme indignation and hesitancy, as if to say, "I really don't want to go any further." This was unusual behaviour for Marybelle, who loved nothing better than to please Scarlet. She wasn't afraid of many things. She was well acquainted with the tigers at the circus, so nothing unsettled her. But on this occasion she seemed reluctant to move forward under the canopy of the red maple trees. Even her tail had stopped swishing, and had grown exceedingly stiff, a clear sign she was anxiously troubled. All of a sudden the forest was filled with whistles from every single direction. Then my grandfather said you could hear thundering feet that sounded like a booming herd of bison galloping across the floor, creating that rumbling sound that left every hair on the back of your neck standing on edge. "Something's not right," he whispered to Scarlet. "Something's very wrong." At the time his hands that were clasped around Scarlet's waist loosened their grip and began to shake violently. He'd never felt fear like this before, as it was coursing through his veins at an alarming speed. He knew something was exceedingly wrong, and even being safely on the back of an elephant offered him very little consolation or comfort. "Something's very wrong, Scarlet," he repeated, his voice trembling. "I know," she said. "I can feel it too. What the heck? Did you hear that? What is that booming sound?" For a second the thunderous sound stopped. All was very still for a lingering moment. Even in the stillness everything became unusually quiet. Far too quiet for the woodgrove that my grandfather had come to know so well as a young boy growing up. He knew those woods like the back of his hands. He could smell and taste the repugnance of this menacing night, as though it clung to you like sticky cobwebs that couldn't be shifted or shaken away. Gone were the chirping sounds of the crickets and the croaks of the frogs, or the hoots of the owl, or a lonely call from a coyote. All my grandfather could hear was the uneasiness of his pounding, galloping heart. An eerie, haunting feeling overcame him that sent shivering chills down his spine as he perceived they were being watched by unseen eyes everywhere, peering at them through the dark shadows. Then they heard loud rustles, snaps, and crunching of heavy feet, thrashing forest debris underfoot. Then they saw them, 4 pairs of bright red eyes, flickering like burning flames of coal in the dark, dark shadows. It was a relief to be high up on an elephant that at shoulder level is easily over 8 feet 7 inches tall, and these red blazing eyes were easily that high off the ground, staring directly at them, but moving ever closer with a cautious confidence. Somehow the moonlight from the canopy caressed the dark, shadowy beings in an ethereal light, which sharpened their features significantly, enabling Scarlet and my grandfather to have a close view of the spectral, almost ghost-like beings that were as intimidating as they were intriguing. Height wasn't a problem to estimate, as taking Maribel's height into account, these anomalous creatures were easily over 8 foot tall, burly, stocky, hefty, built for power and endurance, like very tough, robust farming machinery. Their humanoid-shaped bodies were swathed in long flowing hair that was denser, darker, and blacker than the night. Their arch-shaped heads hung low on their shoulders, where the neck appeared thick and stout, while their primate-like arms dangled well beyond the knees. Yet despite their giant, monstrous proportions, these creatures looked alarmingly human. Their faces were as unique and individualistic as yours and mine are, while the female and male faces were also strikingly distinctive in comparison to each other. The 2 female creatures had more feminine features to the face, while the males appeared much squarer in the jawline. Their faces were dark and shiny. The eyes that gave off a very frightening red eye-shine were deep-set and dark, their cheekbones high, their foreheads wrinkled and sloped, their noses very flat. The creatures reminded my father of a bunch of Chinese tourists gathered together in an excited cluster, clicking away furiously with cameras and admiring the statue of the David in the Accademia Gallery in Florence, Italy. This was how these creatures were behaving towards the elephant. They were staring at Maribel, as if she was quite literally the most transfixing, mesmerizing thing that they'd ever seen in their entire life. Looking back, my grandfather understood why, for he perceived they had clearly never seen an elephant a day in their lives, were marvelling in the size and the lofty majesty of this thing. As let's not kid, if you've never seen an elephant before, it's bound to be a pretty impressive, spellbinding sight. The creatures completely ignored Scarlet and my grandfather, as if they were surplus to requirements and inconsequential to them. They stood there in front of Maribel, just ogling her, as if she was a demigod. My grandfather said their eyes gleamed, sparkled, and danced in wondrous awe, as they talked excitedly among themselves in elevated, fast chatter, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards to each other, in a language my grandfather described as sounding bizarrely like the First Nations people. They were speaking a distinct, audible dialect, while the rising, high-spirited, buoyant ebullience in their voices was exceedingly distinguishable. The irony is that Maribel relaxed. She no longer seemed afraid. She was swishing her tail, which certainly reflected her calm state of mind. She was used to an audience from her years working for the circus, so the fact that these strange beings were studying her was not an issue for her in any way. She was used to being gawked at by strangers. On the contrary, my grandfather thought she was enjoying the creatures' reaction, as she perceived they were enamoured about her, and quite enjoyed the fuss. One of the humanoid creatures reached out to touch the elephant on its trunk, but he did this rather nervously, as if he was afraid by how Maribel might actually react. Maribel almost affectionately put her trunk on the creature's head, using her trunk to explore its pointed tip. And there was this "ah" sound from the creatures. It was clear that they were so bedazzled by her. After they had had their fill of the extraordinary animal, all 4 of the creatures turned around and glided away. My grandfather described their movements as so graceful and flawless. It was like they floated away, he told me. "Did you see that?" said Scarlet, her eyes wide with excitement. "Did you see that? What were those things?" For many years the incident in the woods was discussed frequently by my family, although in the years that followed they soon began to realize that they had encountered a family of Bigfoot, 2 males and 2 females, who were completely beguiled by an elephant. The circus would regularly frequent my grandfather's town once every 2 years, and they would hire the same old meadow from Farmer Bradstock, which meant that my grandfather and Scarlet's relationship bloomed from a sapling into a large tree. So they soon married, but the life at the circus never left my grandmother's heart. As she would say, "You may leave the circus, but the circus will never leave you." So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my Bigfoot encounter happened in the early 60s when I was 11 years old. I would prefer not to mention my name or the exact location of where this all took place, so I'll call myself Kyle for the purposes of this story, and this happened somewhere in North America, and so I'll leave it at that, because remaining anonymous is exceedingly important to me. I grew up in a rural community. The quaint double-storied houses in our street were both spacious with decent-sized yards, so that our houses were loosely spread out by an abundance of space. All the houses were very well maintained, with perfectly manicured lawns and very pretty gardens full of colourful blooms. There was, of course, one exception to the rule, as is often the case in every rural town. This was the one house that invariably visually let down the whole street, with its shoddy appearance, dilapidated state, and overgrown yard that had not seen a lawnmower in months. It was house number 36, that unfortunately was directly opposite our own home. So our two-storey home, with its open windows and great panoramic views, overlooked this dreadful eyesore that was like a big black blob on a beautiful picture that you just couldn't erase. On either side of our homes were idyllic forests, beautiful silvery lakes, and mountainous valleys that stretched back for miles, teeming with an abundance of wildlife from pretty white-tailed deer, the occasional black bear, squirrels, rabbits, and you name it, we had it all, sauntering around the valley and dwelling in the ubiquitous vast areas of wilderness in our part of the world. As you can imagine, my meticulous mother, who never once had a hair out of place and was always scrupulously attired in smart headmistress-style suits, had absolutely no respect for the people at number 36. She would rant and rave to my father about our slovenly neighbours over the road, who when they dared to venture outdoors were still wearing their PJs at 4 in the afternoon. To make matters worse, the portly father, that resembled a very large walrus with his extended girth, would slob around the overgrown garden with a cigarette dangling haphazardly from his mouth and wearing no top whatsoever. Oh, what a dreadful sight, my mother would sigh. Why on earth does that man not wear a top? Does he realise how frightful he looks? Imagine our surprise when the house at number 36 was finally put on the market. But although hopeful, my mother was convinced that no one in their right mind would ever purchase that run-down old shack. She was to be proved wrong when one day we woke up to see a bold red sold sign standing up proudly at number 36. It was like all my mother's Christmases had come at once. She had visions of number 6 being renovated and restored and the garden transformed into a meticulous lawn like the rest of the street. My brother Harry, who was 10 at the time, and I was 11, were in our bedroom, which we shared together on the second story of our home. It had a bird's-eye view of the neighbour's property. One day we saw a furniture removal van parked outside number 36. We could see someone new was moving in, and we hoped with all our hearts it would be a young family with kids of similar ages to ourselves that we could hang around with and play together within the woods. My brother and I watched through our binoculars all the bustling activity going on over the road. 2 very stocky, robust removal men were bringing into the neighbour's house the dreariest, tasteless, drab-looking furniture with only one single bed among all of its items. It distinctly looked like this was a single person's abode, and someone who did not possess even an ounce of style or taste in his tiny finger. Then we saw him, the neighbour who was moving into next door, and he was positively the creepiest man that I have ever seen in my entire life. He would have looked perfect playing the Walking Dead in a zombie movie. He was tall and thin and rather reminded me of a praying mantis. His dull skin looked distinctly grey with a greenish tinge, and his deep-set dark eyes had a predatory look about them, like that of a vulture. And everything about him was distinctly off, and just observing him from our upstairs bedroom gave me the chills. I knew instinctively that this malevolent-looking character was not someone I would ever like to meet face to face. As the weeks passed, much to my mother's disappointment, no efforts were being made by this older gentleman, if you can call him that at all, to transform the house and restore the yard to some level of decency. If anything, the whole place began to become more dilapidated, if that was at all possible, and the grass continued to remain uncut. I despair, sighed my mother. I never knew you could get worse than the previous owner, but this man is distinctly odd. My brother and I noticed how strange our neighbour was, and the way he behaved was positively weird. He would cross over the gravel road to the other side of the street, and then he would purposely slow down and walk past our house like an ant. He would then peer in at us closely, allowing his beady eyes to observe everything and miss absolutely nothing. He would always be thrilled if he actually got a glimpse of my brother and I in the yard, and then his grey face would light up, and he would smile at us with hungry, excited eyes, and a grin that revealed that half his teeth were actually missing. We also noticed that he wore the same shabby tweed jacket and brown pants day after day, without ever refreshing himself with a new change of clothes. So my brother and I had firmly decided that he must smell as bad as he looked. Even his greasy hair that stood up on end like a scarecrow looked like it hadn't been washed a day in his life. It was odd, though, that he was completely clean-shaven, as he didn't seem to bother about the rest of his appearance, not one jot. Often my brother and I would notice that our neighbour would be up to all kinds of activity at the strangest hours of the night. My brother and I would awaken to car doors being shut and engines being started. We would peer out of our window, pulling back the curtains ever so slightly, and we would watch this man putting trowels and bin liners and weird things into his trunk. And on several occasions we did see what appeared to be the shape of a very small body being put into the back of the car, all wrapped up in thick black bundles tied up with white string. It all looked very menacing and ominous, and gave us the distinct impression that this horrible man was up to no good. When my brother and I suggested to my cynical parents that the neighbour over the road was up late at night, we told them that he was a murderer killing small people, and as you can imagine, my parents were furious with us. Even my mother defended the sinister-looking man. "Now, dears, don't be so unkind about the man. You should never judge someone by their appearance. I thought your father and I taught you better than that. You cannot go around the place saying those things. What would people think about you, with such crazy allegations?" That was funny coming from my mother, who was exceedingly judgmental. She was the first person that judged anyone and anything. It was like the pot calling the kettle black. One day out of the blue there was this coverage about a missing boy of 11 years old who disappeared after doing a newspaper round very close to where we actually lived. His bike had been found lying in the middle of the white gravel road, but the boy had seemingly vanished into thin air, and no one knew where he was. Some believed he was abducted, and others thought he might be deceased. From that moment my brother and I were convinced that this neighbour of ours was responsible for this missing boy's abduction. That night we were awoken to the sound of the car on the opposite side of the street, that was always lit up well by my mother's outside light. My brother and I watched the man putting what looked like a body wrapped and tied in a rubbish bag. He then got into the car and drove away. Still in our PJs, my brother and I put on some sneakers and raced out of the house as quickly as we could to the neighbour's property, taking the opportunity to snoop around while he was out. "Let's go and look inside his house to see if we can see anything suspicious," I said to my younger brother. "I'm convinced he's behind that boy's abduction. Did you see that body-like shape?" My brother agreed. "Let's go." Eagerly we crossed the gravel road and ran through the overgrown yard towards the dilapidated house that was quite literally falling apart at the seams. To our amazement, the back door to the kitchen was still ajar, and we crept into the house and looked around. The place smelt rank and musty, and there were piles of dirty dishes that had not been washed for what seemed like weeks. I even noticed a few maggots crawling out of half a tin of baked beans and crawling over the counter. "Who lives like this?" I said to my brother. "This place is utterly disgusting." The living room was full of old newspapers, camera equipment, and huge amounts of ashtrays bursting with cigarette butts that had never been emptied. It was what was on the wall of the living room that made our blood turn cold. There were photographs of boys my age around our neighbourhood that were stuck on the wall in a huge collage, including a photograph of my brother and I in our backyard. We couldn't imagine where this man had taken such a picture of us, and when we had done it, because we never noticed him taking it. On a table there were lots of photographs of missing boys that appeared to have been taken in his house. I did not know the missing boy personally, but I had seen photographs of him in the papers, and this picture was definitely of him. I looked at my brother in horror.
"This man is a monster," I told him. "I think he has killed this boy." "Why?" asked my brother, looking perturbed. "Why would he do this to the poor boy?" "I don't know, but he's super weird," I said. Suddenly we heard the sound of our neighbor returning. Wherever he had been there quick, and now he was coming back. I began to wonder if he had dumped the body in the local lake. We could hear the car door slamming and footsteps coming towards the kitchen. We had not been prepared for this man to get back so quickly. My brother and I tried to slip out of the house as fast as we could, but our feet made a shuffling noise on the gravel. My brother, also in a state of panic, knocked over the flower pot, making things worse with his foot, and it crashed on the ground, making a massive sound. "Who is there?" called the neighbour, dashing towards us with a trowel raised in his hands. The neighbour saw my brother and I staring back at him with frightened, terrified eyes, and we bolted into the woods at the back of the properties that stretched back for miles. We knew that those woods would be the perfect place to hide out, because the trees were very big and there was a lot of dense undergrowth there. We could hear that the neighbour was running after us and shouting, "Come here, boys! Come here! Come here, boys!" As we raced through the woods, we were so terrified because we knew this man would hurt us and possibly even kill us, and we knew we were in mortal danger. Finally, we found the perfect hiding spot in a hollowed-out area of a huge tree that was covered with a mossy curtain. I knew the tree very well. I had discovered it once quite by accident, and discovered that it possessed such a huge hollowed-out cavity within its wide trunk. It was a perfect hiding spot, because we would be very unlikely to be discovered. In that moment I was glad that my brother and I had frequented this forest regularly, and knew the area like the back of our hands, because we could navigate our way well around the space. I think it must have been a full moon, because for a dark night the area seemed incredibly light, as the moonlight came flooding through the canopy, made brighter by the man's flashlight, which he held in one hand and his trowel in the other. He was calling out to us while he searched for us. "I know you're there. Come out, boys," he would shout. "I'm not angry with you. I have a lovely present for you. Why don't you come out now?" My brother and I were breathing heavily, and our hearts were racing, and we were terrified. "Keep very still," I whispered to my brother. "He'll never find us here, I promise you. This hiding spot is brilliant." I was peering through the mossy curtain when I saw the horrible man, with a nasty smirk on his face, waving the flashlight over the forest area, near to where we were hiding. The beam went up and down the forest floor and to either side, and even between the trees. Suddenly we heard the strange whistling sound. I was relieved because I thought someone was coming at last. It was the middle of the night, though, so who could it be, I wondered. The old man straightened up, looking very concerned, and held out his huge yard trowel in his hand that he looked like he was going to use to strike down this person that was whistling. He hid behind a tree to get himself into a better position for a surprise attack. All this happened while my brother and I sat watching in horrified silence. Was he going to kill the person that was coming? I wondered all this in horror. Or maybe he was going to knock them unconscious. "We should warn the person that's coming," whispered my brother. "He might hurt them." "And give up our hiding place," I whispered. "No, we can't do that." The old man lashed out his yard trowel towards the stranger, and as he did this, a pair of long, muscular, hairy arms grabbed the trowel from his hands like it was a kid's toy. He then turned towards the man and let out a huge roar that sounded exactly like a lion. "What on earth is that?" I whispered to my brother. "It's a hairy monster." Our neighbour looked utterly terrified, and his legs were wobbling, and he was shouting, "No! No! Please, no, no, no!" The creature using the trowel pounded our neighbour's head with a blow that sounded like an egg being cracked wide open. I knew in that instant he was dead, because his body lay there limp and lifeless. The creature then made a few grunts and heaved the man onto his shoulders like a sack of potatoes and glided gracefully through the woods towards the gravel road where we lived, all the while whistling quite happily to himself. "What's he doing?" whispered my brother. "I think he's throwing the body onto the road so that it can be found away from the forest. He's clever, whatever he is." "What is he?" whispered my brother. "I have absolutely no clue," I said. "I've never seen anything remotely like him before." "He looks like a monster ape man," said my brother. The creature was indeed huge, at the very least 800 pounds, and 8 foot tall, and 4 to 5 feet wide, with a cone-shaped head, long face, long arms, and hair from top to the bottom was all shaggy and black. "Supposing he kills us," said my brother. "He won't," I assured him. "We'll hide until he's gone." The creature returned, and was still whistling to himself, and he continued on his way through the forest, and then he was finally gone. My brother and I raced home as fast as we could, and woke up our parents to tell them that the neighbours had killed the missing boy and dumped his body in the lake, and had chased after us in the woods, and we had hidden and observed him being killed by an ape man. My parents did not believe a word of what we were saying, and they insisted we went to bed and stop making up all these dreadful stories. The next day our neighbour's lifeless body was discovered lying in the middle of the gravel road, and his house was searched by the police, and they believed that he was indeed responsible for several missing boys, and was called a paedophile, that they had been looking for many long months. It did not seem that the police were at all concerned about the mysterious cause of his death, or more likely, they just didn't care. Months later, divers went searching in the lake, and 3 little boys' bodies were recovered there. It was all exceedingly sad for our rural community, who could not believe that this had happened on our turf. My parents were mortified that this awful man had lived opposite us, but refused to acknowledge that we, as her children, had been right about everything. My brother and I never got to see the hairy man again, and even though we tried to tell our parents about the creature that we had seen, they told us to stop making up ridiculous stories, and that no such creature ever existed. My mother would say we needed to learn to be credible, and that if we spoke to people like this, we would be in all kinds of trouble. It was only about in 2013 that I was to learn that this creature is called Bigfoot. I have no idea whether he would have hurt us or not, but he did get a trowel rammed into his face by that neighbour of ours, and so maybe he was just fighting back. I guess we'll never really know. As for my mother, she got her wish. Someone completely bulldozed the house opposite us and rebuilt the home, which had a manicured lawn and terraced garden, and turned out to be almost as meticulous as my mother's yard. As you can imagine, my mother loved our new neighbours, and to make matters even better, they had 2 boys our age, which we grew to spend so much time with in the years that followed.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.